Welcome to part 4 in this series called The Time of the End. In this message, we're going to cover what's called the 6,000-year Bible chronology. This Bible chronology is really a timeline of the plan of salvation. And it can be quite controversial where people say, well, you're time setting. We are told that we are not to determine or try to determine a definite hour, day and hour of Jesus coming. This is not an attempt to do that. What this is simply a way for us as God's people to understand where we are in the stream of time. The real message is not this message of a timeline or a chronology, but it is Revelation 14, 6 through 12. It's the three angels' message. And this is because everyone will be judged before Christ returns. They will choose to be on his side or on Satan's side prior to Jesus' second coming. So a timeline, as you can see, will not benefit anyone if they think that Jesus is coming at this point in time and, oh, I can wait until that point in time to get ready. Probation is going to close for everyone on this planet sometime prior, and we don't know when that time is. And so the important message is the three angels' messages. And nobody knows when their probation will close. The three angels' messages is about choosing whom you will serve and whom you will worship. And in Revelation 14 it says, fear God and give glory to him, not to man. It tells us that the Church of Rome is the false church of Babylon, and she is full of abominable acts and doctrines. And it also tells us not to receive her mark, which is the mark of Sunday worship. God has given this chronology so we can see where we are in the stream of time, and we can then prepare ourselves and others so we will not be deceived. And we can then focus on giving the three angels' messages. So the chronology simply gives us the timeline of the plan of salvation. So what is this plan? The plan of salvation is really a rescue operation that follows the pattern of the weekly cycle, but in years. And we know that there will be 6,000 years of work, followed by 1,000 years of rest, called the millennium. This is in Revelation. And in this presentation, we will see how God has woven a timeline of events in the Bible that we can assemble in order to see when the 6,000 years started and when it will end. So how does this work? If you're putting a timeline together and you're using events to back them up, those events must be tied to each other in some way. And in this case, we'll be able to see that they will be tied back to back. Some of them will be. And some of them will have some overlaps. And we'll explain that as we go. But we have to know when they are tied back to back in order to have a continuous timeline. Finally, after determining when the 6,000 years of the plan of salvation will end, we will look at the Jubilee and why it performs a pivotal role in the Bible chronology timeline, because it actually interlocks with the timeline and it cannot be moved. So, the big question, when did time start? Adam started aging after he sinned because he no longer had access to the tree of life. So the plan of salvation was not put into effect by God on this earth until he actually sinned, until Adam sinned. Therefore, the beginning of the chronology of the earth starts with Adam's sin and not when the earth was created. Now, I'm going to give you this whole presentation in one quote from 5 Bible Commentary, page 1081, paragraph 6. And it goes like this. Christ, in the wilderness of temptation, stood in Adam's place to bear the test he failed to endure. Here, Christ overcame in the sinner's behalf 4,000 years after Adam turned his back upon the light of his home. Separated from the presence of God, the human family had been departing every successive generation farther from the original purity, wisdom, and knowledge which Adam possessed in Eden. So it says Christ in the wilderness of temptation, when he was tempted in the wilderness, stood in Adam's place 4,000 years after Adam turned his back upon the light of his home. So where do we start when we're calculating or accumulating this information on the plan of salvation? We begin in the book of Genesis, where the ages of the first humans on earth are listed, starting with Adam and going down through the lineage of Jesus. And if we begin on Genesis 5:3, it says, "And Adam lived 130 years and begat Seth." So he lived 130 years, and that's when Seth was born. So we're going to put 130 years up there. The next one is in Genesis 5:6, which says, "And Seth lived 105 years and begat Enos." All right, so we put 105 years up there. Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan in Genesis 5:9. Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalaleel in Genesis 5:12. Mahalaleel lived 65 years and begat Jared in Genesis 5:15. And so we put 65 years up there. And Jared lived 162 years and he begat Enoch in Genesis 5:18. So there's 162 years. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. Lamech lived 182 years and begat Noah. There's 182 years. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters was upon the earth in Genesis 7:6. Add all those together, and from the time that Adam sinned to the beginning of the flood is 1,656 years. All right, so there's our first landmark. And there's actually 7 of these landmarks that we're gonna see that will be put on the board in a timeline. And this 6,000-year timeline looks as follows. From the start of sin is at the top, and the sum of that is going to be at the bottom. So we can count how many years it's been since the time of sin that sin started. So this first one is 1,656 years to the time of the flood. All right, the next one. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. This is found in Genesis 11:10. Now one might think that the words after the flood mean when the flood had finished. But we're going to see here that it actually means after the flood began. Let's look at Genesis 9:28 and 29. It says, "And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died." Okay, but you remember earlier it said that Noah was 600 years old when the waters began to appear on the face of the earth. So if he was 600 years old when the flood began, and then he lived another 350 years, and he died at 950 years, how much time was there for the flood? The flood actually occurred in about a year, a little over a year's time period. So if Noah lived 600 years before the flood, and then there was a year, let's just round it off to a year, and then there was a year of a flood, wouldn't Noah be 951 years old when he died? That's correct. He would be 951 years old. So the words after the flood we have to take as meaning after the flood began. So Noah lived after the flood began 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So then we take Genesis 11:10 with Shem, when it says that Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. It means after the flood began. So we're going to use 2 years for the time when Arphaxad was born after the flood began. And Arphaxad lived 5 and 30 years and begat Selah. Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber. Again, we can just go through these genealogies. And Eber lived 4 and 30 years and begat Peleg. And Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. You notice how they're back to back? It's talking about the father and then the son, and then his son, and then his son. So we can tie these all together. And Ru lived 32 years and begat Serug. And Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. And Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran in Genesis 11:26. Well, based on that verse, who was born at the 70 years of Terah's life? Was it Abram, Nahor, or Haran, or was there triplets? Well, we're going to pick one. Since Abram is mentioned first, we believe that he was the oldest, and so he was born first when Terah was 70 years old. So therefore, the 70 years refers to Abram's birth, because the Bible chronology leads to Christ through Abram, not Nahor or Haran. So we put 70 years on the screen. And the next connection in the timeline is not going to be the birth of Isaac, as one might think, but rather the covenant with Abram. So if there's no connection again from one event to another, then we won't know where we are in the timeline. When Abram was 90 years old and 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after me. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised." This is found in Genesis 17:1 and 10. So Abram was 99 years old when the Lord appeared to him and said, "This is my covenant which ye shall keep. You shall circumcise every man-child among you." All right, so from the beginning of the flood to the covenant made with Abraham was 391 years. We're going to put that on the timeline. So from the flood to the covenant with Abraham was 391 years. And you can see the total summation is on the bottom. The covenant made with Abraham was 2,047 years after Adam sinned. Moving on. We're now going to look at the covenant with Abraham from the time that the covenant was given to Abraham to the exodus of the children out of Egypt. And there are several texts for this. One of them is found in Galatians 3, verses 15 to 17, which says, "Brethren, I speak after the manner of men. Though it be but a man's covenant, yet if it be confirmed, no man disannulleth, or addeth thereto. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect." All right, so there's 3 verses there. What does that mean? What it says is, the covenant that was confirmed before God in Christ, made with Abraham, and the law, which was 430 years after in Mount Sinai, cannot disannul, that it should make the promise of none effect. So now the sojourning of the children of Israel, Abraham was called by God to sojourn, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. This is found in Genesis 12, 40, and 41. "And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." So the covenant made with Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 1 and 10, to Israel's exodus from Egypt is 430 years, found in Exodus 12:40. It can now be added to the timeline. So we're going to add this 430 years from the time of the covenant made with Abraham to the Exodus. And now we have 2,477 years since Adam sinned. That's when the Israelites departed from Egypt. 1 Kings 1 verses 6 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So the 480th year extended, as it said, to the 4th year of Solomon's reign. What we want to do is actually make this to the beginning of Solomon's reign. So we must subtract the 4 years to get the first year of his reign. 480 minus 4 is 476. We're going to put that on the timeline. So from the time that the Israelites left Egypt to the start of Solomon's reign was 476 years. That's 2,953 years after Adam sinned. And Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. This is found in 2 Chronicles 9, verses 30 and 31. We're going to put that now on the timeline, that Solomon reigned for 40 years, and then that starts Rehoboam's reign, or what we're going to call the reign of the kings. And that was 2,993 years after Adam sinned. Okay. At this point, we see in the Bible that Israel was divided into 2 separate nations 3 years after Solomon's reign of 40 years. Judah had 2 tribes ruled by Rehoboam, which is Solomon's son, and Israel had 10 tribes that were ruled by Jeroboam. This is found in 2 Chronicles 10 and 1 Kings 12, verses 1 through 20. Now all the reigns of the kings of Judah can be added up from Rehoboam through Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the last king taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to do 2 sets of these. The first 10 kings are going to be shown on the screen first. Rehoboam, he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. It's found in 2 Chronicles 12, verse 13. Abijah reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, found in 2 Chronicles 13, 1 and 2. Asa died in 1 and 40th year of his reign, so he ruled for 41 years. Jehoshaphat reigned 20 and 5 years in Jerusalem, found in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 31. Jehoram, he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Ahaziah reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. Joash was hid in the house of God 6 years, and Athaliah reigned over the land. Athaliah was his grandmother. She reigned 6 years. Joash then reigned 40 years in Jerusalem, found in 2 Chronicles 24, verse 1. Amaziah reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and Uzziah reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. So the first sets of kings from Rehoboam through Uzziah was 222 years. Now the second list of 10 kings starts with Jotham. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. Ahaz reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. Hezekiah reigned 9 and 20 years in Jerusalem, 29 years. Manasseh reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. Ammon reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. Josiah, he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years, found in 2 Chronicles 34, verse 1. Jehoahaz reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Jehoiakim reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And Jehoiachin reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, found in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 9. Zedekiah reigned 11 years in Jerusalem for a total of 171 and a half years from the reign of Jotham through the reign of Zedekiah. So adding together both sets of the 10 reigns for the kings of Judah yields 222 years for the first set and 171 and a half years for the second set. Gives us 393.5 years for all 20 kings. Now, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah were reigning in Judah during the 3 sieges by King Nebuchadnezzar. That means we cannot put the end of Zedekiah's reign and the start of the 70-year captivity back to back. The captivity actually started in Jehoiakim's reign, so the 2 time periods overlap each other. We'll have to calculate this overlap and subtract it from the timeline to get the starting and ending points correct. So let's do that. But first, let's look at Patriarchs and Prophets, page 428, because it gives us a clue why this is true. It says, in Spirit of Prophecy, Patriarchs and Prophets, when early in the reign of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar for the first time besieged and captured Jerusalem and carried away Daniel and his companions with the others specifically chosen for service in the court of Babylon, the faith of the Hebrew captives was tried to the utmost. So this establishes that Daniel and his companions were carried away the very first time that Nebuchadnezzar besieged and captured Jerusalem. Okay, that gives us a starting point. Now let's look at 4 Bible Commentary, page 1158. Because she goes further to say that in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, very soon after Daniel was taken to Babylon, Jeremiah predicted the captivity of many of the Jews as their punishment for not heeding the word of the Lord. So this tells us that not only was this the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar upon Jerusalem when Daniel and his companions were taken to Babylon, but it was also in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. All right, moving on. It says the Chaldeans were to be used as the instrument by which God would chastise his disobedient people. Their punishment was to be in proportion to their intelligence and to the warnings that they had despised. This whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, the prophet declared, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So in this quote, we see that in the 4th year of Jehoiakim is when the captivity started, and it would go for 70 years. Thus we see that this happened, that the start of the 70 years of the house of Israel's captivity started with Daniel and his companions in the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign. So we saw earlier that Jehoiakim reigned 11 years. We saw that Jehoiachin reigned just 1/4 of a year, or 3 months. And Zedekiah reigned 11 years. That gives us a total of 22¼ years. So this overlap must compute as follows. We saw earlier that 393½ years was a total amount of time for the 20 kings. We subtract these 3 kings of 22¼ years out. That gives us 371¼ years. And we add back in Jehoiakim's reign. Remember, it said that it was in the 4th year. So 4 years had not transpired, but it was during the 4th year. So we're going to add 3¾ years to Jehoiakim's reign, which brings us to 375 years from the end of Solomon's reign to the time that the Israelites went into captivity with Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to put that on the timeline now, 375 years. And when they were put into captivity. The next time period is the length of Judah's captivity in Babylon, which we saw already. It's also found in Jeremiah 25, verses 9 and 11. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Jeremiah 25, 9 and 11. We're going to put that 70 years on the timeline. And that shows us that from the time of Adam's sin to when Judah was actually released from Babylon was 3,438 years since Adam sinned. All right. Daniel's prayer in chapter 9, it says in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 556, had been offered in the 1st year of Darius, the Median monarch, whose general Cyrus had wrested from Babylonia the scepter of universal rule. The reign of Darius was honored of God. To him was sent the angel Gabriel to confirm and to strengthen him. Found in Daniel 11, verse 1. Upon his death, about 2 years of the fall of Babylon, within about 2 years of the fall of Babylon, Cyrus succeeded to the throne. And the beginning of his reign marked the completion of the 70 years since the first company of Hebrews had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar from their Judean home to Babylon. So again, in this quote, we see again that the Hebrews first taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, from that point until the end of the reign was 70 years. Now we can use a secular date for the Jews' first release from Babylon under Cyrus the Great of 536 BC. 536 BC is well documented in secular records, and so we can now use this date. So we can populate from this point the 7 biblical time periods with their BC date simply by reverse calculation. So here we go. 536, 606, 961, 1021, 1497, 1927, 2318, and 3974 BC is when Adam sinned. The great controversy between Christ and Satan that has been carried forward for nearly 6,000 years is soon to close. This is found in Great Controversy, page 518. So now let's add Christ's ministry to the timeline and the calculation for the end of 6,000 years of sin. 562 years later, Christ started his ministry in AD 27, which is exactly 4,000 years after Adam sinned in 3974 BC. If we add 2,000 years from there to give us a 6,000 year mark, that brings us to the year 2027 AD, not too far away. Okay, so how do we know that the end date for the 6,000 years is correct? It must coincide with the Jubilee. I'm going to take you through early writings, page 34 and on, because we're going to see how the time, in the time of the end, that is described by Ellen White in early writings will bring to us to the time when the Jubilee is announced. So let's read this. Let's go through this. Early writings, page 34. In the time of trouble, we all fled from the cities and villages. This is what God showed her in vision. She said, we all fled from the cities and villages in the time of trouble, but we were pursued by the wicked, who entered the houses of the saints with a sword. They raised the sword to kill us, but it broke, and fell as powerless as straw. Then we all cried day and night for deliverance, and the cry came up before God. The sun came up, and the moon stood still. The streams ceased to flow. Dark, heavy clouds came up and clashed against each other. But there was one clear place of settled glory, whence came the voice of God, like many waters, which shook the heavens and the earth. The sky opened and shut and was in commotion. The mountains shook like a reed in the wind and cast out ragged rocks all around. The sea boiled like a pot and cast out stones upon the land. And as God spoke the day and the hour of Jesus' coming and delivered the everlasting covenant to his people, he spoke one sentence and then paused while the words were rolling through the earth. The Israel of God stood with their eyes fixed upward, listening to the words as they came from the mouth of Jehovah and rolled through the earth like peals of loudest thunder. It was awfully solemn, and at the end of every sentence the saints shouted, "Glory, hallelujah!" Their countenances were lighted up with the glory of God, and they shone with the glory as did the face of Moses when he came down from Sinai. The wicked could not look on them for the glory, and when the never-ending blessing was pronounced on those who had honored God in keeping his Sabbath day holy, there was a mighty shout of victory over the beast and over his image. Then commenced the Jubilee, when the land should rest. I saw the pious slave rise in triumph and victory and shake off the chains that bound him, while his wicked master was in confusion and knew not what to do. For the wicked could not understand the words of the voice of God. soon appeared the great white cloud. It looked more lovely than ever before, and on it sat the Son of Man. So we see that the Jubilee occurs at the second coming of Jesus. So how can we understand and count the Jubilee cycle? That's really what we want to know now. How do we understand this Jubilee? I don't think anyone ever has counted correctly the Jubilee cycle and when to begin counting of the Jubilee. But at least we do see that the Jubilee occurs at the second coming of Christ. The Jubilee actually starts in Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 10. So let's go through that. It says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai." And these are key words I've highlighted in orange. It says, "In Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and saying to them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement. In the day of atonement ye shall make the trumpet sound throughout your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family." Leviticus 25, verses 1 through 10. So let's review what we just read. The Lord spoke to Moses when he was in Mount Sinai. He said, "When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, but in the 7th year it shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land. Thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. So 7 times 7 is 49 years, simple math. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land." So counting of the Jubilee must start when they come into the land. And it must be 6 years of work, then a Sabbath year of rest. There must be 7 times 7 years of these Sabbath rests, or 49 years. And then the 50th year is the Jubilee. Now, counting the 49 years is actually the same process as counting the days of the week. If we count the days of the week, we know that Sunday is the first day. And if we count to the 6th day, that's Friday, and the 7th day is Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. If we are to count, let's say, 2 weeks, we would then say that Sunday is the 8th day, but it also is the first day. So you would say that day 1 through 7 and day 8 is Sunday, but it's also the first day again, so you can count 7 more days to the 7th day Sabbath. And the 15th day is Sunday, but it is also the first day again, and so on until we get to the 49th day or year. And then the 50th year is again Sunday, or the first year, or the first day, or the first year of the next Jubilee cycle. This is how it tells us to count the Jubilee cycle in Leviticus 25. If we don't do it this way, then we're not going to have correct results. So let me show you graphically with these slides how to count the Jubilee cycle. Again, the weekly cycle would be day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and the 7th day is the Sabbath. We'll do that again for the second set of weeks, the 3rd week, the 4th week, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. So that's our weekly cycle. So there's that. In this case, it represents 7 weeks, but the weeks also represent years for the Jubilee cycle. So that can also represent 49 years. But let's do the counting now sequentially. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for the first set of years. Then we have the 8th year, and then we continue counting through 13. We have the 14th, etc. 15, the 21st, first Sabbath, the 28th, the 35th, the 42nd, and the 49th. So there's your 49 weeks or years of the sequential counting of the Jubilee cycle. The 50th year starts on the next cycle of Jubilee. And you have 7 years again, followed by the 49 years, and we have our complete counting of the next cycle to 49 years. This is how you count the Jubilee cycle. Okay, let's apply this a little bit further. We need to find out when they came into the land. Now that we know how to count the cycle, let's figure out when they came into the land so we can figure out where to start. We're going to start with Joshua 14, verses 5 through 10, where it says, "As the Lord commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did as they divided the land. Then the children of Judah came unto Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said unto him, Thou knowest the thing that the Lord said unto Moses, the man of God, concerning me and thee and Kadesh Barnea. 40 years old was Moses when the servant of the Lord sent me. 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to espy out the land. And I brought him word again as it was in mine heart. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me made the heart of the people melt. But I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses sware on that day, saying, Surely the land whereon thy feet have trodden shall be thine inheritance, and thy children's forever, because thou hast wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord hath kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, even since the Lord spake this word unto Moses, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, lo, I am this day 85 years old. Caleb said he was 40 years old when Moses sware on that day, saying, Surely the land whereon thy feet have trodden shall be thine inheritance. And now, lo, I am this day 85 years old. So we know that the children of Israel were in the wilderness for 40 years, right? Let's insert this 40 years in there. We've got 40 years. And so this is when they entered the land of Canaan, is it not? But wait a minute. Caleb was already in his 40th year when he was spying out the land. His quotation now, he says, I am 85 years. So he is later. So he is now 85 years old on his birthday. So we must therefore subtract a year to have a full, complete years, rather than calling his 40th year a full year, because it was not. So it was 44 years in duration of time from the spying out of the land until Caleb's 85th birthday. We're going to put those 4 years in there and see that the land was divided in 1453 BC, or 2,521 years after Adam sinned. When I first saw this, I decided to put these numbers in a spreadsheet. Everyone knows about how to use Excel, right? Most of us do. So I put these numbers in a spreadsheet, and I'm listing this on the screen now for your benefit. Jubilee 1, they were supposed to start counting the Jubilee years starting in 2,521 years after Adam sinned, or in 1453 BC, when they came into the land. So the next Jubilee was going to be in 1404 BC, or 2,570 years after Adam had sinned. I'm going to show you a proof here that these numbers are correct from 2521 to 2570, and of course 2619, just to show that these numbers are actually provable. So let's take this first counting from 2521 or 1453 BC to the next Jubilee. We're going to use the same process of the weekly cycle. So they came into the land on a Sunday, let's call that, and that will be day 1 or year 1 in 1453 BC. And you see Monday was the second one in 1452, 1451 was the third one, or Tuesday, 1450. Remember, BC counts down. Wednesday was the 4th, Thursday was the 5th, Friday was the 6th, Saturday was the 7th year, or day of rest. So let's just kind of fast forward down to the next page. Again, 2535 and 1439 BC was the 15th, start of the 15th week or 15th year. And at the bottom of the screen is the 28th. We see that was the Saturday or the 7th year. And another screen here, I just clicked forward. 1425 BC was the 29th consecutive year. Down at the bottom is the 42nd consecutive year, or Saturday. And on this last screen, we see 43 was a Sunday, and year 50 is the Jubilee, which is the 2,570 years since Adam sinned, or 1404 BC. So this confirms that we are counting correctly. All right, so let's go back to the original Excel spreadsheet. We see that 2570 or 1404 BC is the next one. And I'm going to fast forward through all these numbers, let you look them up on the screen here. At the bottom of the screen is the 16th Jubilee, or 1718 BC. And we're just going to keep looking. And look through these numbers with me, and you'll see that they're kind of, odd numbers. 1306, 1257, 1012. I mean, there's nothing really, spectacular about these numbers, I don't think. All right. The next screen here, although we see down here at the bottom where, in the bottom of the screen, where 32 BC was a Jubilee, and the next Jubilee was actually in 18 AD. And Jesus started his ministry in 27 AD. So 9 years prior to Jesus starting his ministry, there was a Jubilee in the year 18 AD. Okay, moving ahead with the next screen, we see that in the year 116 AD was a Jubilee, 4,089 years since Adam sinned. Just keep looking at those numbers. They all look just kind of, okay, whatever, right? We have 851 AD at the bottom of the screen. All right, the next screen, again, the year 900 AD was a Jubilee. And at the bottom of the screen, 1635. So again, all those numbers are just kind of whatever they are. Look at this last one. 1684 AD was a Jubilee. And it was 5,657 years since Adam sinned. The next one is 5,706 years, 5,755 years, etc., etc. But when you get to the 6,000 year mark, it comes out exactly to 6,000 years since Adam sinned. And exactly with the year 2027. Now, I tried to move these numbers back and forth to see if there was just some glitch. Why would this come out perfectly like this? And it did it the very first time. I didn't reverse engineer this. I didn't know how to reverse engineer it. I just followed what God was showing me in His Word. When they come into the land, Caleb's 85th birthday, etc., etc. And I put that number in the spreadsheet and I calculated exactly like God tells us to calculate the Jubilee. And it came out the first time at this number, 6,000 years in 2027. So it just put tingles up and down my spine when I realized the gravity of this moment, that this is something real here. This is not something that you can create or manufacture on their own. This is, there's just too much going on here. It's just too complicated for it to come out too simply in this manner. So anyway, I just share that with you because it was just amazing to me. So in the year 2027, is the 6,000th year of the Jubilee. And we saw earlier that in early writings there is a Jubilee when Jesus comes. So God said to start counting the Jubilee on the 2,521st year from when Adam sinned, in 49-year cycle increments, according to the weekly cycle, and proclaim a Jubilee on the 50th year, which is also the first year of the next cycle. The last Jubilee comes out to exactly 6,000 elapsed time years in 2027, thus aligning perfectly with chronological time. So the next Jubilee occurs in the 6,000th year since Adam sinned in 2027. Let's look at some landmark Jubilees. This is also very interesting. In 1453 BC is when they came into the land, and Caleb was 85 years old. Caleb died in 1438 BC, and Joshua died at 110 years old in 1412 BC. It's found in Judges 2 verses 8. It says in Judges 3 that Israel did evil for 8 years. And if you keep adding those 8 years up, we come to the first Jubilee in 1404 BC. And this is found in Judges 3:9 when Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, actually delivered Israel from Cush Shanrish Shanhaim in Judges 3:9. I don't know if I said that correctly, but you get the idea. He's a long name. And so we see, remember, the Jubilee is a time of deliverance when the slaves are set free and when everyone receives his possession, his land back. And so that actually happened in that time period, in that year of 1404 BC. And Othniel was a type of Christ that delivered Israel from this king. 1364 BC was the end of the 40 years when the land rests from war. And the next Jubilee that has significance is when King David started his reign. Now we know that David was a type of Christ, a deliverer, and the start of his reign was a Jubilee year in BC 1061. Solomon then reigned for 40 years until 1021 BC. And he started building the temple in 1017 BC, 480 years after the Exodus. Another landmark Jubilee is after Hezekiah's reign. This actually event, if you look this up in 2 Kings, chapter 18 and 19, you'll see that God told them that there would be a deliverance from Sennacherib, and they would start planting and sowing, and they would start doing that in the 8th year. Well, it's the 8th year after a Jubilee that they are told to do that. And if you look in Leviticus 25:21, so this lines up perfectly with that event. The Jubilee occurred in 718 BC, and 8 years later they were told to sow and reap. All right, in 606 BC is when the Babylonian captivity occurred, the first siege by Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah reigned until 599. He started in 599 and he ended in 588 BC. And in 571 was another Jubilee year. The invasion of Babylon by Darius was in 538. In 536 BC, the decree of Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem was announced, which was the first release of the Jews. Ahasuerus, he reigned, which is also known as Xerxes I. And there was actually a Jubilee year in 473 BC with Queen Esther. And if you can read the story in the book of Esther of how the Jews were persecuted and a death decree was announced, but then it was turned around and the Jews were allowed to persecute all those who were trying to kill them, and it was on a Jubilee year. In 465, Artaxerxes reigns, and Artaxerxes decreed his decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 457 BC, which began the 2300-day prophecy. Artaxerxes finished reigning in 424 BC. William Miller was born in 1782 AD, which was a Jubilee year. William Miller was the founder or the leader of the Millerite movement. That is the movement where the different Protestants from different religions joined together and read the Bible, and they figured out that Jesus would come back in 1844, which of course was the wrong event. It was the right date. It was when Jesus went into the most holy place, but it was the wrong event. Jesus obviously hasn't come yet. So those days should be shortened. Persecution ended prior to 1798. And we see the next series of Jubilees occurred in 1831, 1880, 1929, 1978, and the next one is going to occur in 2027 on Christ's second return. Just to kind of expand a little bit on the persecution, let's look at what it says in Great Controversy, the 1888 version, page 266. The persecution of the church did not continue throughout the entire period of the 1260 years. God's, in mercy to his people, cut short the time of their fiery trial. In foretelling the great tribulation to befall the church, the Savior said, "Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." Through the influence of the Reformation, the persecution was brought to an end prior to 1798. Christ was not in as favorable a position in the desolate wilderness to endure the temptations of Satan as was Adam when he was tempted in Eden. The Son of God humbled himself and took man's nature after the race had wandered 4,000 years from Eden and from their original state of purity and uprightness. Sin had been making its terrible marks upon the race for ages, and physical, mental, and moral degeneracy prevailed throughout the human family. This is found in One Selected Messages, page 267. So again, more confirmation that when Jesus was in the wilderness to be tempted of Satan was 4,000 years from the time that Adam sinned. Again, 5 Bible Commentary, page 1081, we saw this in the beginning. Christ in the wilderness of temptation stood in Adam's place to bear the test he had failed to endure. Here Christ overcame in the sinner's behalf 4,000 years after Adam turned his back upon the light of his home. Separated from the presence of God, the human family had been departing every successive generation farther from the original purity, wisdom, and knowledge which Adam possessed in Eden. Another quotation from the Review and Herald on July 28, 1874 tells us, "The Son of God humbled himself and took man's nature after the race had wandered 4,000 years from Eden and from their original state of purity and uprightness. Sin had been making its terrible marks upon the race for ages, and physical, mental, and moral degeneracy prevailed throughout the human family. When Adam was assailed by the tempter in Eden, he was without the taint of sin. Christ, in the wilderness of temptation, stood in Adam's place to bear the test he failed to endure." The typical feast days have all been completed except for the Feast of Tabernacles. Christ replaced the typical with the antitypical when he was the sacrificial lamb. We are living in the antitypical Day of Atonement since October 22, 1844. And God is a God of order, and Christ died on the very day of Passover at the very time of the evening sacrifice. The Spirit of Prophecy states that at the second coming of Christ, we will be 7 days ascending to heaven and enjoying the banquet in heaven on the 8th day when Christ will gird himself and serve us. And this is found in Review and Herald, July 21, 1851, paragraph 7. So we see that this is the antitypical Feast of Tabernacles. So Christ's second coming will then be sometime in the fall of 2027, right before the Feast of Tabernacles. And God will actually announce the day and hour of his return during the seventh plague. So from the fall of 2027, we can back up 3.5 years to determine approximately the time when the papacy will rise in Revelation 13:1 and rule for 1,290 days according to Daniel 12:11, the spring of 2024. So the question has always been, hey, your time setting. No man knows the day or the hour of Jesus' coming. And we are not to live on the basis of time setting. Well, this is, again, not an attempt to do that, but this is simply showing you what the Bible says and what the Spirit of prophecy says about where we are in the stream of time. And through simple math, we can figure some of these things out. But we will never know the actual day and hour of Jesus' second coming until God announces it. Why is that? Well, for two reasons. God has said He's not given that information to mankind. And Spirit of Prophecy says that if it was given to mankind, then we would not make the right use of it. We would delay our preparation, and we would not announce to the world that Jesus is coming at the right timing, etc. The other issue here is that during this time period of the end, there's going to be so many calamities and confusion. There's going to be so many things going on that the earth and the cycle of the earth, the cycle of the seasons will still continue, but they will be confused. And the way that the Day of Atonement is calculated today is based on the barley harvest. It's the way it's always been done in years past. But we think and we believe that that barley harvest will not occur in the last final year of 2027 because of all the calamities that will be happening on this earth and all the wars that will be happening, the mass confusion that will be occurring on this planet. So there won't be any way for God's people or anyone to actually calculate or determine the day and hour of Jesus' second return. But God, in His mercy, will announce the day and hour so that God's people will know exactly when Jesus is coming. And this, we believe, will be at the end of the 1,335 days found in Daniel 12:12. So let's get the complete picture here. The Sunday law will therefore be enforced sometime in the spring of 2024, which starts the 1,260 literal days found in Daniel 12:7, the times and a half, otherwise known as the time appointed. If you haven't seen the other previous three presentations on the time of the end, go back to the first one, because that's where we go through the presentation where the Bible reveals this information on the time appointed in Daniel 12:7. Let's look at this graphically. The end shall be at the time appointed. That's stated over and over again in the book of Daniel. It starts with a preparation time, which is where we are now. And in 2024, the spring of 2024, is when all nations will drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, meaning the papacy. They will lay down their sovereignty to the papacy, and they will set him up, or the Pope, as the one world ruler. That will be in the spring of 2024. That starts two time periods. It starts the 1,335 days and the 1,290 days of the rule of the papacy. After that, fire will come down from heaven. They will use that working of that miracle to convince people that they have God's approval and God is with them, and that everyone should pass a Sunday law. At that point, the people of the nation of the United States will demand from the legislatures, they will demand a Sunday law. We saw that in the Spirit of Prophecy. That's only a 30-day time period. Legislation will then be passed, and this is when the sanctuary of strength is polluted in Daniel 11:31. This is starting of the judgment of the living, and it actually starts when that law is enforced. This is what Spirit of Prophecy tells us. So people that are worshiping on Sunday today are not receiving the mark of the beast. It's only when they are intelligently shown that this is not the true Sabbath. It is a false Sabbath. It's an apostate Sabbath. It is the sun worship. It's from the people in times past who worshipped the sun god. This is where it all started. And once they are shown that and they still continue to worship on Sunday, when Sunday law is enforced, that is when people will receive the mark of the beast. Following this will be the national ruin of the United States. National apostasy is followed by national ruin, which is followed by a no buy and no sell. So just like we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, or pandemic, whatever you want to call it, where people had to wear a face mask in order to go into a grocery store and buy food, this will be even more significant. Your bank accounts will be turned off. You will be not allowed to go to work anymore, and you will not be able to buy or sell. So this is why God has been telling His people to get out in the country, get your gardens designed and planted and growing, and be out of the city when this happens, because you won't be able to buy or sell. During this time is also known as the shaking time. We saw this in the second presentation. The three angels' messages will be proclaimed throughout the entire earth, and at the final closing of probation is when the loud cry will be given. The loud cry is simply, in Revelation 18:1, the fourth angel coming down out of heaven, proclaiming with a loud voice not to receive the mark of the beast. This is God's people joining hand in hand throughout the entire earth, just pleading with people not to receive the mark of the beast, but to fear God and give glory to Him. This will be followed by the close of probation, when every single person on the entire planet has made their decision either for God or against Him. And this is when the seventh angel sounds in Revelation 16:7. This is then when the daily is restored to Christ. Remember, the daily is the transfer of power, or the rulership of the scepter. Christ will take that scepter back from Satan. And this starts the 7 last plagues. This is when a final death decree will be given, and this is when we need to flee to the mountains. So we'll leave our homes in the country for retired mountain homes, or wherever we can find in the mountains to live and dwell. This is also the time period when the apostate Protestant kings, they turn on the great whore, or the papacy, and they strip her naked and they burn her with fire. So she is destroyed at the end of the 1290 days. The day and hour of Jesus' return is then announced at the end of the 1335 days during the fall of 2027. And again, God says in Isaiah 13:12, I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir. That is your character. God is going to change your life, change your mind, change your way of thinking. If you let Him, He will transform you into His likeness, that you may be sealed for eternity with a pure heart and a pure mind, and that your sins will be blotted out at that time of probation closing. Your sins will be blotted out from the record. You will no longer have a criminal record for all the things that were done. You will be clean and pure and sealed that way for eternity, so that it will be as though you have never sinned. So that for eternity you will not have to think or remember any of the things that have happened on this planet. That is such a wonderful thing that God has done for us and is going to do for us. So let your characters be refined as gold. The testing process is going on now. This is why it's called the shaking time and the sifting time coming up. Because everyone will be shaken from their middle ground to either be on God's side or to be on man's side, i.e. the devil. Let's have some closing thoughts here. In Early Writings, page 75, she says, the Lord has shown me that the message of the third angel must go and be proclaimed to the scattered children of the Lord, but it must not be hung on time. So presenting this message to you today, I'm trying to emphasize this point to you as best that I can. God has given us the information, but that's not what we're to use to promote to the world. We're not to go to the world with this information, but we're simply to understand it and know where we are in the stream of time so that we can give the three angels messages, so that people won't make the wrong decision when the Sunday law is presented to them in deception and coercion, that they will be forced. Either you're going to lose your job or you're going to keep your job and get the mark of the beast. But they're not going to be told it that way. But that's exactly what's going to happen. I saw that some were getting a false excitement arising from preaching time. But the third angel's message is stronger than time can be. I saw that this message can stand on its own foundation and needs not time to strengthen it. And that it will go in mighty power and do its work, and will be cut short in righteousness. So will the time be cut short in righteousness? This is also a misnomer that many of God's people are thinking, that God's going to cut short the time in righteousness. No, He cuts short the work. He cuts short the persecution in righteousness. That's what we've been reading in these quotations. So God in His mercy is only going to allow the devil to go so far in persecuting God's people. It will go in mighty power and do its work. This work of preaching the three angels' messages. In Maranatha, page 19, paragraph 4, it says, 3 and 4, had the Church of Christ done her appointed work as the Lord ordained, the whole world would before this have been warned, and the Lord Jesus would have come to our earth in power and great glory. So if God's church had done her appointed work, God could have come already. It is the unbelief, the worldliness, unconsecration, and strife among the Lord's professed people, not with the world, but among the Lord's professed people, that have kept us in this world of sin and sorrow so many years. We may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination many more years, as did the children of Israel. So the children of Israel in the time of the wilderness. But for Christ's sake, His people should not add sin to sin by charging God with the consequence of their own wrong course of action. So don't charge God that, hey, you're not coming back. Why aren't you coming back, Lord? Because of our own insubordination against God. God is simply waiting for His people to accept Him and to humbly come before Him and confess and forsake their sins and ask for the cleansing of their souls through Christ's blood. This is what God is waiting for, but time is still marching on. Brethren and sisters, would that I might say something to awaken you in the importance of this time. The significance of the events that are now taking place. I point you to the aggressive movements now being made for the restriction of religious liberty. God's sanctified memorial has been torn down, and in its place, a false Sabbath, bearing no sanctity, and this stands before the world. And while the powers of darkness are stirring up the elements from beneath, the Lord God of heaven is sending power from above to meet the emergency by arousing His living agencies to exalt the law of heaven. Now, just now, is our time to work in foreign countries. Some more closing thoughts that are found in Testimonies, Volume 6, page 18. As America, the land of religious liberty, shall unite with the papacy in forcing the conscience and compelling men to honor the false Sabbath, the people of every country on the globe will be led to follow her example. Our people are not half awake to do all in their power, with the facilities within their reach, to extend the message of warning. That's a pretty solemn words. We are approaching and fast approaching this time of restriction of liberty of conscience. They will compel you to honor the false Sabbath. The Lord of heaven will not send upon the world His judgments for disobedience and transgression until He has sent His watchmen to give the warning. He will not close up the period of probation until the message shall be more distinctly proclaimed. The law of God is to be magnified. Its claims must be presented in their true sacred character, that the people may be brought to decide for or against the truth. Yet the work will be cut short in righteousness. The message of Christ's righteousness is to sound from one end of the earth to the other, to prepare the way of the Lord. This is the glory of God, which closes the work of the third angel. So everyone, I want to thank you for listening and watching. I want you to understand that we are living in the stream of time very, very close to Christ's second coming. But this is not the impetus of our message. Our message to the world is to give the three angels, fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come. Don't fear man, fear God. Choose God. And then the second one, Babylon has fallen, that great city which made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. She's making all the nations, through her deception, follow her false dogmas, her false doctrines, and especially the one main point of controversy now before us, the issue of whether to worship on the first day of the week, Sunday, or the seventh day of the week, Sabbath. And don't be deceived. If you Google which day is the day of the week for Saturday, they're going to tell you now, which they just made this change in Google back in September of 2021, they made the change to say that Saturday is the sixth day of the week, based on ISO standards. So in Daniel 7, it says that he, the papacy, would think to change times and laws. And this is what they're actually doing. They've changed times. They've changed the law of God to say that the first day of the week is the Sabbath or Sunday. They have now changed the time to say that Sabbath is the sixth day of the week, but it's not. It's the seventh day of the week. It's been that way forever. So don't be deceived by these things that is out there on the Google platform. Remember, and then the third angel's message is not to receive the mark of the beast. So if you worship on Sunday when you've been told not to, and it's being enforced, that's when you will receive the mark of the beast. And God says, don't be deceived by that. Worship on the seventh day of the week. Worship on my Sabbath. Because it is a sign between me and thee throughout all generations. This is a sign that God has where the world will see that we are His people, is because we worship on the seventh day of the week. Well, thank you again. I pray that all this information will not be so overwhelming. If you want to go back, just rewind it and rewind it, and so you can look and see how things develop. It's amazing how the Jubilee is locked into the chronology. It can't be moved. Try it. I challenge you to try moving this Jubilee in some way or fashion. It'll jump by 49 years one way or the other if you do. So what's the point in that? We know that we are at the end of the 6,000 years, very closely at the end of time. But the main point again is fear God and give glory to Him. He is your Creator. That's why He deserves your worship. May God bless you as you contemplate these things. Thank you.
morning, everyone.
Jó reggelt kívánok mindenkinek!
I'm going to be speaking 2 times today.
Ma kétszer fogok beszélni,
And this morning I'm not going to be preaching so much.
és ma délelőtt nem is annyira prédikálni akarok,
But maybe acting as a teacher.
hanem inkább tanítani.
Many things I'm going to show you probably already know.
Sok minden, amit most mondani szeretnék, az olyan, amit talán már tudtak is.
But we will call this like a refresher course.
Úgyhogy ez most ilyen ismétlő tanfolyam lesz.
Some of the things I'm going over this morning, I would like you to have on your mind for this afternoon.
De azért szeretném most ezeket felfrissíteni, mert szeretném, hogyha amikor délután beszélek, akkor ez frissen éljen a gondolatainkban.
And like every good teacher, I would like to give you some homework.
És mint minden jó tanár, én is szeretnék nektek adni egy kis házi feladatot.
Between now and my next meeting,
A mostani és a következő előadás között,
if you could take a few moments and read the book of Joel.
Szeretném, hogyha vennétek magatoknak valamennyi időt, és elolvasnátok Joel könyvét.
It's just 3 chapters,
Csak 3 fejezet,
but if you're pressed for time,
de
don't have enough time,
hogyha nincs elég időtök,
please try to at least read chapter 2.
akkor legalább a második fejezetet olvassátok el.
I'm going to be talking a little bit this morning about the feast days.
Ma az ünnepekről szeretnék egy kicsit beszélni. Tehát a zsidó ünnepnapokról.
Okay. Before I get started, I just want to go over a couple of things.
Néhány dolgot először szeretnék átgondolni veletek.
It seems as no matter wherever I go for camp meetings,
Akárhová megyek így összevetelre,
inevitably I run into a brother or sister that is keeping the feast days.
Mindenhol olyan emberekbe botlok, akik megtartják a zsidó ünnepeket.
Lunar Sabbaths.
Vagy a holtszombatokat.
Or some other aspect of the law.
Vagy más valami törvénnyel kapcsolatos dolgot.
And I don't want to give a wrong impression because I'm going to be talking about the feast days today.
És nem akarok rossz benyomást kelteni, hiszen én ma is az ünnepekről akarok beszélni.
I believe we have a lot to learn from what God is trying to reveal about the feast days.
Azt gondolom, hogy nagyon-nagyon sokat tanulhatunk abból, amit Isten az ünnepnapokon keresztül, az ünnepeken keresztül megosztott velünk.
But that doesn't mean that I believe that it's necessary to keep the feast days today.
Természetesen ez nem azt jelenti, hogy azt gondolnám, hogy ma is meg kell tartanunk az ünnepnapokat.
I don't know of any Christians today who say you should be circumcised.
Nem tudok egyetlen keresztényről sem, aki napjainkban azt tanítaná, hogy körül kell metélkedni.
And the reason that is because Paul is so emphatic about it in Galatians.
És ez azért van, mert Pál ezt annyira határozottan kihangsúlyozza Galata levélben.
Can't argue with it.
Ezzel nem lehet vitatkozni, annyira egyértelmű.
So you never hear somebody come along to say you need to be circumcised.
Úgyhogy ezért nem jön elő senki, aki azt mondaná, hogy körül kell metélkedned.
But inevitably somebody will read something in the Old Testament.
De ennek ellenére vannak, akik olvassák az Ószövetséget,
where it says that you should do this forever.
És azt olvassák benne, hogy örökké való rendeléshez, hogy örökké cselekedni kell.
And they interpret that to mean that we should be keeping these feasts or this aspect of the law today.
És ezt úgy magyarázzák, hogy a törvénynek ezen részeit ma is tartani kell, meg kell tartanunk.
I'd like to read a set of verses that are not read very often by Adventists.
Néhány olyan igeverset szeretnénk most felolvasni, a mi adventista körökben nagyon ritkán hallható.
One of the reasons we don't read these verses very often is because many times they're used against us.
Azért nem szoktuk ezeket olvasni, mert általában ezek olyan igeversek, amiket a mi fejünkhöz szoktak vágni az ellenségeink.
Whenever we're trying to share the Sabbath with someone.
Mondjuk, amikor a szombatot próbáljuk az embereknek bemutatni.
A person rejects the Sabbath truth.
Valaki elveti a szombat igazságát,
And they'll bring us to these verses.
és ezeket az igeverseket mutatja nekünk.
Colossians 2.
Például Kolossé 2,
Starting in verse 6.
6. verstől.
Paul says, as ye have therefore received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk ye in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith as ye have been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. Beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, and after traditions of men and the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and ye are complete in him, which is the head of all principalities and powers.
Tehát Kolossi 2.6-tól 10-ig. Azért, amiképpen vettétek a Krisztus Jézust, az Urat, akképpen járjatok ő benne, meggyökerezvén és tovább épülvén ő benne, és megerősödvén a hitben, amiképpen arra tanítattatok, bűvölködvén abban hálaadással. Meglássátok, hogy senki ne legyen, aki bennetek zsákmányt vet a bölcselkedés és üres csalás által, amely emberek rendelése szerint, a világ elemi tanításai szerint, és nem a Krisztus szerint való, mert ő benne lakozik az Istenségnek egész teljessége testileg, és ti ő benne vagytok beteljesedve, aki feje minden fejedelemségnek és hatalmasságnak.
First of all, because of Christ and his righteousness.
Mindenek előtt Krisztus és az ő igazságossága miatt
I can't help but highlight verse 10.
Csak hangsúlyozni tudom a 10. verset,
It says ye are complete in him.
ami azt mondja, hogy ti ő benne vagytok beteljesedve.
If you are complete, what are you lacking?
Hogyha te be vagy teljesedve, akkor milyen vagy?
Nothing.
Aha. Tehát, hogyha te ő benne tökéletes vagy, akkor te semmi vagy.
If our faith could just grab...
Semmi sem hiányzik.
Bocsánat. Tehát, hogy akkor mi hiányzik? Akkor semmi sem hiányzik. Elnézést.
Okay?
Oké.
All right. If we could just grab hold of these kinds of promises,
Hogyha megragadjuk ezeket az ígéreteket,
I'm sure our experience would be a greater blessing.
akkor azt gondolom, hogy a tapasztalatunk még nagyobb áldás lehet.
But let's take a look at verse 8.
De nézzük meg a 8. verset.
He says, beware.
Azt mondja, hogy meglássátok, hogy vigyázzatok,
Unless somebody comes to you and spoils you
hogy senki ne legyen, aki bennetek zsákmányt vet
through philosophy.
a bölcselkedés által.
What can you think of that is a philosophy?
Vagy másik fordításban filozófia által. Mi lehet egy filozófia?
A philosophy is something that is made up in men's minds. It's not real.
A bölcselkedés vagy a filozófia az olyas valami, amit az emberi elme produkál. Tehát csak ott van az elmében, de nem valóságos.
This is a philosophy.
Ez egy filozófia például.
1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1.
Hogy az 1 meg 1 meg 1 az egyenlő 3. Vagy 1-jel, bocsánat, 1-jel.
Okay? It says also, after vain deceit,
Azt mondja utána, hogy üres csalás által.
which is just believing a lie.
Ami nem más, mint pusztán elhinni egy hazugságot.
After the traditions of men,
Amely emberek rendelése szerint, vagy az emberek hagyománya szerint való.
We remember that Jesus said, "In vain do you worship me, teaching for doctrine the traditions of men."
Maga Jézus mondta ezt, hogy hiába tisztelnek engem, ha oly tudományokat tanítanak, amelyek embereknek rendelése, vagy embereknek hagyományai.
Traditions are not a bad thing.
A hagyomány nem egy rossz dolog önmagában.
You probably have some family traditions.
Lehet, hogy nektek is vannak családi hagyományaitok.
But when you start taking religious traditions,
De amikor a vallási hagyományokhoz érünk,
and saying, "This must you do in order to be saved,"
és azt mondja valaki, hogy ezt és ezt kell tenned ahhoz, hogy üdvözülj el,
you have made a religious doctrine.
Ebből vallásos tantételt kreáltál.
And you have put it in the place of Christ.
És Krisztus helyébe helyezted ezt.
Then the last statement says,
Az utolsó ilyen kijelentés ezt mondja,
"And after the rudiments of the world and not after Christ."
hogy a világ elemi tanításai szerint, és nem a Krisztus szerint való.
What does your word for rudiments say? Is it like elements?
Basic elements.
Elements.
Yes,
Okay.
elements.
So, what are the elements of the world?
Mik a világ elemei?
In the context of what Paul is talking about,
Abban a szöveg környezetben, amiben ezt Pál mondja,
the elements of the world are the law.
a világ elemei az a törvénnyel egyenlő.
And I'll show this to you in Galatians in a few moments.
És Galata levélből ezt meg is mutatom nektek mindjárt.
The law as it was written by Moses.
A törvény, ahogy az Mózes által megiratott,
In the Ten Commandments.
a 10 parancsolatban,
In the writings of the Old Testament.
az ószövetségi írásokban,
Are the rudiments of the world.
azok a világ elemei.
It had a worldly sanctuary.
Volt egy világi szentélyük.
Ceremonies that pertain to things that were done here on earth.
Olyan szertartások, amik világi dolgokhoz kapcsolódtak.
The law said things that were difficult.
A törvény mondott néhány nehéz dolgot.
If you touched a certain dead animal, you were to be separated for a certain amount of time.
Hogyha egy elpusztult állatot megérintettél, akkor egy bizonyos időre karanténba helyeztek.
Earthly. That's earthly.
Ez világi dolog, földi dolog.
Anybody plan on touching a dead animal in heaven?
Bárki a mennyben megérintene egy halott vagy egy elpusztult állatot? Lehet ilyen?
There were animal sacrifices.
Állatáldozatok voltak.
Is there going to be any animal sacrifices in heaven?
Mennyben lesznek állatáldozatok?
I mean, I could tell you, there are some things in the Bible we don't even talk about.
Vannak bizonyos dolgok a Bibliában, amiről egyáltalán nem is beszélünk.
Men with men.
Férfiak férfiakkal hálnak.
Men with beasts.
Férfiak barommal.
Earthly restrictions.
Ezek elvilági korlátozások.
These things are irrelevant to things of heaven.
Ezek a dolgok a mennyei élet szempontjából lényegtelenek.
And he goes on to say in verse 14.
A 14. vershez érve,
blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink or in respect of a holy day, new moon, or of Sabbath days, which were a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ.
Ezt mondja. Azáltal, hogy eltörölte a parancsolatokban ellenünk szóló kézírást, amely ellenünkre volt nekünk, és azt eltette az útból, odaszegezvén azt a keresztfára, lefegyverezvén a fejedelemségeket és a hatalmasságokat, őket bátran mutogatta, diadalt vévén rajtuk abban. Senki azért titeket meg ne ítéljen evésért vagy ivásért, avagy ünnep vagy újhold vagy szombat dolgában, melyek csak árnyékai a következendő dolgoknak, de a valóság a Krisztusé.
Jesus Christ took all these things away. He removed them.
Jézus Krisztus mindezeket a dolgokat elvette, eltávolította.
But he put something else in its place.
De tett valamit a helyébe.
Himself.
Önmagát.
If you want to look to the law,
ha törvényre akarsz tekinteni,
and obey the law,
törvénynek akarsz engedelmeskedni,
you are serving the law.
akkor a törvényt szolgálod.
But if you look to Christ,
de ha Krisztusra tekintesz,
and you are obeying Christ,
és Krisztusnak engedelmeskedsz,
then that's a whole different situation.
Ez egy teljesen más helyzet.
Instead of your behavior being steered by the law,
ahelyett, hogy a viselkedésedet a törvény kormányozná,
your behavior is now steered by Christ.
Most a viselkedésedet Krisztus kormányozza.
Now, don't get me wrong.
Ne értsetek félre.
God gave the law to help steer the people.
Isten azért adta a törvényt, hogy segítsen az embereket kormányozni.
It's a reflection of his character.
Mert ez az ő jellemének visszatükröződése.
And when we read the law, we see wonderful principles.
És amikor a törvényt olvassuk, akkor csodálatos elveket látunk benne kirajzolódni,
that are good,
amelyek jók,
holy,
szentek,
just,
igazak
and right.
és helyesek.
But notice what Paul says in Galatians chapter 4.
De nézzük meg, mit mond Pál apostol Galata levél 4. fejezetében.
I just want you to see how he associates new moons and feast days and all of these things with the law and circumcision.
Szeretném, hogyha látnánk azt, hogy hogyan kapcsolja Pál apostol az újholdakat, az ünnepeket, és ezeket a dolgokat a törvényhez, meg a körülmetélkedés, ezeket a dolgokat a törvényhez és ehhez a rendszerhez.
In verse 1 and verse 2, he points out that a child, though a king, is still a servant.
Tehát Galata 4 első és második versében arról beszél Pál, hogy egy gyermek, noha örökös, de amíg gyermek, addig kiskorú.
He's under teachers until his father says he's old enough to understand on his own.
És gyámok és gondviselők alá van vetve, mert még nem érti meg magától a dolgokat.
Then in verse 3, he repeats what he said in Colossians 2. He says, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world.
És a 3. versben ugyanezt mondja, mint Kolossi levélben, azonképpen mi is, amikor kiskorúak voltunk, a világ elemei alá voltunk vettetve szolgaként.
He goes on and he says, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons.
5. versben így folytatja, hogy a törvény alatt levőket megváltsa, hogy elnyerjük a fiúságot.
It says here that we were redeemed because we were under the law.
Azt mondja ez a szakasz, hogy azért kellett megváltatnunk, mert a törvény alatt voltunk.
In other places he says you are not under the law.
Máshol azt mondja Pál apostol, hogy ti nem vagytok a törvény alatt.
Were you redeemed from the law?
Meg lettünk váltva a törvénytől.
We were certainly redeemed from the condemnation of the law.
Természetesen meg lettünk váltva a törvény kárhoztatásától.
You were redeemed from sin.
Meg lettünk váltva a bűntől.
And that's what the law does.
És pontosan ezt teszi a törvény.
It condemns the sinner.
Kárhoztatja a bűnöst.
But it can do nothing else.
De ettől többet nem tud tenni.
Now, were you just redeemed from the law of Moses?
Csak a Mózes törvényétől lettünk megváltva?
Because the law of Moses said, if you do some of these bad behaviors,
mert Mózes törvénye azt mondja, hogy ha ezeket a rossz viselkedéseket követed, ezeket csinálod,
that were not written in the Ten Commandments,
amik éppenséggel nincsenek szó szerint benne a 10 parancsolatban,
they were still sin.
attól azok még bűnök.
Because it was contrary to God's will.
Azért, mert ezek ellentétesek Isten akaratával.
For example,
Például,
I mentioned men with beasts.
említettem ezt a durva példát, hogy férfiak férfiakkal, vagy férfiak barommal.
That is sin.
Ez bűn.
Does it say anything in the Ten Commandments about that? Does it say anything in the Ten Commandments about that?
Tehát a 10 parancsolat konkrétan beszél erről?
No.
Nem.
So, sin isn't just involved in the Ten Commandments.
Tehát a bűn benne foglaltatik a 10 parancsolatban.
Now, I know we understand the law is spiritual.
De értjük azt, hogy a törvény az lelki.
And it does encompass all of those things written in the law of Moses.
És hogy mindaz, ami Mózes törvényében meg van írva, az benne van.
But we have been redeemed from those beggarly elements.
De minket azt írja, hogy mi meg lettünk váltva ezekből a szolgai elemekből, vagy ezekből a szegényes elemekből.
Paul goes on to say, in verse 10. Now let's start in verse 9.
Galatians 4.
Yes, Galatians 4, verse 9.
Tehát Galata 4-ben a 9. verstől olvassuk.
But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? Go ahead and read that.
Most azonban, hogy megismertétek az Istent, sőt, hogy megismert titeket az Isten, miként tértek vissza ismét az erőtlen és gyarló elemekhez, melyeknek megint újból szolgálni akartok.
Someone who is in bondage is a slave.
Az, aki szolgaság alatt van, az egy rabszolga.
He says, you have been set free from these weak and beggarly elements.
Azt mondja Pál apostol, hogy ti megszabadultatok ezektől az erőtelen és gyarló elemektől.
And then he goes on to describe what some of those are.
És utána leírja Pál, hogy mik ezek az elemek.
He says, ye observe days and months and times and years.
Azt mondja, megtartjátok a napokat és hónapokat és időket, meg az esztendőket.
He says, I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain.
Féltelek titeket, hogy hiába fáradoztam körültetek.
All of this is in the context of him telling the brethren that if they're circumcised, Christ means nothing to them.
Azt mondja mindezekkel Pál apostol, hogy ha ti körülmetélkedtek, akkor Krisztus nektek semmit nem használ.
Does that mean if you keep days and months and times and years, Christ means nothing to you?
Akkor ez azt is jelenti, hogyha valaki napokat, hónapokat, ünnepeket, éveket tart, akkor számukra is Krisztus semmit nem jelent?
Actually,
Semmit nem használ?
if you want to keep a feast day, I have no issue.
Tehát, hogyha te szeretnél megtartani egy ünnepnapot, nincs vele problémám.
But when you say, I must do this in order to be saved,
De hogyha azt mondod, hogy ezt kell tennem azért, hogy üdvözüljek,
then you're turning salvation away from Christ to a weak and beggarly element.
akkor az üdvösséget Krisztusról egy erőtelen és gyarló elemre helyezed át.
I hope that helps you to understand why I don't keep feast days.
Így talán világossá válik számotokra, hogy én miért nem tartom meg az ünnepnapokat.
I believe it is a weak and beggarly element.
Mert hitem szerint ez egy elemi vagy egy erőtelen és gyarló elem.
But now I'd like to talk about the feast days.
És most ennek alapján szeretnék nektek az ünnepekről beszélni.
There were two groups of feast days.
Két csoportra osztható az ünnepkör.
The spring feast
Voltak tavaszi ünnepek,
and the fall feast, or the feast of the harvest.
és az őszi vagy az aratási ünnepek.
The spring feast consisted of the Passover,
A tavaszi ünnepekben volt a páska,
the feast of unleavened bread,
a kovásztalan kenyerek ünnepe,
the waving of the wave sheaf,
a zsengekéve meglóbálása,
and the feast of weeks, which we call Pentecost.
és a hetek ünnepe, vagyis a pünköst.
The Passover was on the 14th of Nisan.
A páska az Nisán hónap 14-én volt,
Came in the spring.
tavasszal,
And by the very word Passover, I know you understand the story of what that was to be a memorial of.
well, in Hungarian it
Doesn't?
no, because we just took the Hebrew word anyway.
Okay.
Na mindegy, szóval, hogy a 2 Mózesben magyarázza meg, hogy mit jelent a páska. Ugye ezt abból a héber szóból vették át, aminek a jelentés az, hogy átmegy. És tudjuk, hogy ez mit jelent. Ugye átment a pusztító angyal Egyiptomon, és átment azok felett a házak felett, ahol a vér volt kenve. Tehát ez az ünnep jelentés, hogy átmegy.
Okay, well, the Passover was on the 14th day of the month.
Tehát ez az első hó 14. napján volt.
The next day for 7 days was the feast of unleavened bread.
A következő, a 15. napon a kovásztalan kenyerek ünnepe kezdődött.
The day after the Sabbath in this week in this chain was the waving of the first fruits.
És ezen a héten, a szombat után következő nap, az a zsengekéve meglóbálása volt.
And on the 50th day was the feast of weeks.
És az 50. napon a kovásztalan kenyerek ünnepéhez képest volt a pünköst.
What we call today the Passover or Pentecost.
Na, tehát ezt hívták hetek ünnepének, mi pünkösnek ismerjük ezt.
Now all of these spring feasts typified something that happened in the history of Israel.
Tehát ezek az ünnepek mind egy-egy olyan eseményt jelöltek, amelyek Izrael történetében történtek.
On the night of the Passover, on the 14th of Nisan,
Tehát a páska estéjén, Nisán 14-én
it was the death of the firstborn.
meghaltak az elsőszülöttek Egyiptomban.
The next day, for 7 days, they were to have no leaven in their houses.
Aztán a következő 7 napon át nem volt kovász az otthonukban.
The removal of leaven is a type of a removal of what?
És a kovásznak az eltávolítása az mit jelképez? Minek az eltávolítását?
Sin.
A bűn eltávolítását.
The waving of the wave sheaf occurred.
Aztán a zsengekéve meglóbálása mikor történt?
On the day that Israelites crossed the Red Sea.
Amikor az izraeliták átmentek a Vörös-tengeren.
And in their experience on the day of Pentecost,
és az ő tapasztalatukban pünkösd napján
God gave them the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai.
Isten odaadta nekik a 10 parancsolatot a Sínai hegyen.
Every one of these feasts had a fulfillment exactly on the day in the life and ministry of Christ.
Ezek a napok kivétel nélkül beteljesedtek Jézus Krisztus életében.
Jesus died on Passover.
Jézus a Páska napján halt meg.
Of course, he was the firstborn.
Ő volt az elsőszülött.
It's interesting that when Jesus was here on earth,
Érdekes, hogy amikor Jézus itt volt a földön,
he always knew when he was going to die.
mindig tudta, hogy mikor fog meghalni.
He always knew what year he was going to die.
Pontosan tudta, hogy melyik évben fog meghalni,
And he always knew what day he was going to die.
és azt is tudta, hogy melyik napon fog meghalni.
I mean, crowds would come to push him over the cliff.
hát onnan tudjuk, hogy volt olyan, hogy jött néha a csőcselék, és le akarta taszítani a hegyről.
And he'd walk right out.
És átment közöttük.
Other times he would say things like, my time is not yet.
Máskor azt mondta, hogy még nem érkezett el az én időm.
How did he know these things?
Honnan tudta ő ezeket?
Well, we understand he was a prophet.
Hát nyilván tudjuk, hogy ő próféta is volt.
So I imagine his father could have revealed it to him in a dream or a vision.
Hát lehet, hogy ezeket álomban vagy látomásban tárta fel előtte az atya.
But Daniel chapter 9
De ott van Dániel 9. fejezete,
tells us exactly what year the Messiah would come.
ami pontosan megmondja, hogy melyik évben fog eljönni a messiás.
Says exactly what year he would die.
Azt is elmondja, hogy pontosan melyik évben fog meghalni.
So if Jesus understood the scriptures, which I believe he did,
Így, hogyha Jézus megértette az írásokat, és én hiszem, hogy értette,
he would have been able to know what year he was to come on the scene for his baptism.
akkor ő pontosan tudhatta azt, hogy melyik évben kell neki előállnia, hogy megkeresztelkedjen és elkezdje a szolgálatát.
He would have known that 3.5 years later he was going to die.
És tudhatta azt is, hogy 3,5 év múlva meg fog halni.
And he knew he was the Passover lamb and that he was going to die on the 14th of Nisan.
És tudta azt is, hogy ő a páska bárány, és hogy Nisán 14-én fog meghalni.
Jesus died on a Friday.
Jézus pénteki napon halt meg.
The next day began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the removal of sin.
A következő napon kezdődött a kovásztalan kenyerek ünnepe, ami a bűn eltávolítását jelképezi.
This would have been Sabbath.
És ez egy szombati nap volt.
When Jesus died, did he remove sin?
Amikor Jézus meghalt, ő eltávolította a bűnt.
Something to think about.
Ez egy érdekes gondolat.
When Jesus went into the grave,
Amikor Jézus a sírba került,
was sin destroyed?
ezzel a bűn meg lett semmisítve?
Interesting.
Érdekes.
The day after the Sabbath was the waving of the wave sheaf.
A szombat után következő nap a zsengekéve meglóbálása volt.
So in the year Jesus died, that would have been Sunday, because it's the day after the Sabbath.
Abban az évben, amikor Jézus meghalt, ez éppen vasárnapra esett, mert a szombat után következő nap volt.
The waving of the wave sheaf was the presenting before God the first fruits of the spring harvest.
A zsengekéve meglóbálása arról szólt, hogy bemutatták az aratásnak az első zsengijét Isten előtt.
Jesus also fulfilled this on the day to the letter.
Jézus ezt is napra és betűre pontosan betöltötte.
He himself, who is the first fruits, was resurrected.
Ő, a mi első zsengénk feltámadt.
There was also a great earthquake.
Volt egy hatalmas földrengés is.
And there were others who were raised from the grave with him.
És vele együtt mások is feltámadtak.
When Mary came to see and saw him at the tomb.
És amikor Mária eljött, hogy meglássa Jézust a sírban,
Jesus said, "Don't touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father."
azt mondta neki, hogy ne illess engem, mert még nem mentem fel az én atyámhoz.
He took those who were resurrected with him.
Elvitte magával azokat, akik vele együtt feltámadtak.
He went to his Father
Felment az atyához,
and appeared as the waving of the wave sheaf, the first fruits of those who are resurrected from the dead.
és megjelent előtte, mint az első zsengéje azoknak, akik feltámadnak.
On the 50th day,
Az 50. napon,
on the day of Pentecost,
pünkösd napján
we had the outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
kitöltetett a Szentlélek.
On that day, Jesus, the Bible says, was glorified.
Ezen a napon Jézus a Biblia szerint megdicsőítetett.
He received back from the Father the things that he laid aside, his omnis.
Visszakapta az atyától azokat a dolgokat, amiket letett őnála, a mindeneit, a mindenhatóság, minden tudás, mindenütt jelen valóság.
And he was able to pour out himself to his people.
És ismét képessé vált arra, hogy kiárassza önmagát az ő népére.
Each one of these feasts was fulfilled to the letter on the day.
Mindezek az ünnepek szó szerint és napra pontosan beteljesedtek.
But all the feasts have not been fulfilled. All the feasts have not been
De az
fulfilled.
összes ünnep még nem teljesedett be.
Let's take a look at the fall feasts.
Nézzük meg az őszi ünnepeket.
There were 3 fall feasts.
3 őszi ünnep volt,
They began in the 7th month.
ami a 7. hónapban kezdődött.
On the first day of the 7th month was the blowing of the trumpets.
A 7. hónap első napján volt a kürtölés napja.
10 days later was the Day of Atonement.
A 10. napon volt az engesztelés napja,
And 5 days later was the Feast of Tabernacles.
és a 15. napon pedig a sátoros ünnep.
Now, in the spring feasts,
A tavasz ünnepek esetében
something in the life and ministry of Christ happened on every one of those days.
minden egyes ünnepnapon valami esemény történt Krisztus földi életében.
There's no doubt that they had an impact on God's people.
Kétségtelen hatása volt ezeknek az eseményeknek Isten népe életére nézve.
But something very specific happened with respect to Christ and his ministry.
Mert valami rendkívüli dolog történt ezeken a napokon Krisztus életében és az ő szolgálatában.
Now you might be thinking, well, the Day of Atonement has already been fulfilled.
Talán azt gondolják sokan, vagy azt gondoljuk sokan, hogy a nagy engesztelési nap már beteljesedett,
Because on October 22nd, 1844,
mert 1844. október 22-én
Jesus went from the holy place to the most holy place.
Jézus bement a szentélyből a szentek szentjébe.
But that was not the Day of Atonement.
De ez nem a nagy engesztelési nap volt,
That began the investigative judgment,
ez a vizsgálati ítéletnek a kezdete volt.
an examining of the records.
Ez a feljegyzések megvizsgálása volt.
The prophecy of the 2300 days gives us the year of the investigative judgment, or the end of time.
A 2300 éves profécia az a vég idejét határozza meg, a vizsgálati ítélet kezdetét.
But everyone in this room knows that the Day of Atonement is yet future.
De mindnyájan tudjuk azt, hogy maga az engesztelési nap még a jövőben van.
The Day of Atonement is the close of probation.
Mert az engesztelési nap az a kegyelemidő lezárulásáról szól.
It is the day that Michael stands up.
Arról a napról, amikor felkel Mikáel, a nagy fejedelem,
Says, let the just be just and the unrighteous be unrighteous.
és kijelenti, hogy a szentek legyen, hogy az igazak legyenek igazak, az igazságtalanok pedig legyenek továbbra igazságtalanok.
That happens on a specific day.
Ez egy konkrét napon fog megtörténni.
Now, am I implying that we could possibly know when the close of probation is?
Azt akarom ezzel mondani, hogy elképzelhető, hogy tudhatjuk, hogy mikor lesz a kegyelemidő vége?
I didn't set these dates.
Hát nem én határoztam meg ezeket a napokat.
If the disciples would have understood the word of God,
Ha a tanítványok értették volna Isten igéjét,
could they have known the year and the day that Jesus was going to come and die?
tudhatták volna az évet és a napot, hogy Jézus mikor jön el és mikor fog meghalni?
Yes.
Így van.
Our pioneers did some time setting.
Az úttörőink foglalkoztak idő meghatározásokkal.
First they believed Jesus was coming in 1843.
Először azt gondolták, hogy Jézus 1844-ben fog eljönni.
And they realized they made a mistake.
43-ban, bocsánat,
They set a
43-ban.
date in 1844.
És rájöttek, hogy hibáztak, és ezért 44-re tették az időpontot.
And then as they began to look at it, they decided that Jesus was going to come on October 22nd, 1844.
És ahogy ezt tovább vizsgálták és tanulmányozták, arra jutottak, hogy Jézus 1844. október 22-én fog eljönni.
Were they right?
Igazuk volt?
No.
Nem.
The scripture very clearly says, no man knows the day nor the hour of Christ's coming.
Mert a Szentírás egyértelműen megmondja, hogy egyetlen ember sem tudja az ő eljövetelének napját vagy óráját.
But as a result of their study of the scriptures, they knew something was going to happen in the year 1844.
De ahogy tanulmányozták az igét, rájöttek arra, hogy valami történni fog 1844. október 22-én.
Even though they went through discouragement,
És bár elcsüggedtek,
they held on to Christ.
Ragaszkodtak Krisztushoz,
And they found the true meaning of what was to happen in 1844.
és felfedezték, hogy mi is történt valójában 1844-ben.
But in our pioneers' experience,
De az úttörőink tapasztalatában
was there a blowing of the trumpets on the first day of the seventh month?
volt kürtzengés a 7. hónap első napján?
No.
Nem.
Did the Day of Atonement occur in 1844?
Megtörtént a nagy engesztelési nap 1844. október 22-én?
No.
Nem.
Did they honor the Feast of Tabernacles 5 days after October 22nd, 1844?
Megtartották a sátoros ünnepet 5 nappal később, 1844. október 22-e után?
No.
Nem.
But I mean the Day of Atonement, that is huge, Ken.
De hát a nagy engesztelési nap az valami rendkívüli dolog, nem?
Could we possibly know what day and month was the close of probation?
Lehetséges tudnunk, hogy mely napon és mely hónapban van a kegyelemidő lezárulása?
But you might be saying, but Ken, no man knows the day nor the hour.
Hát mondhatjátok nekem, hogy na de hát Ken testvér, hát senki sem tudja a napot és az órát.
But that's of Christ's second coming.
Na de hát ez a kijelentés, ez Krisztus második visszajöveteléről szól.
I'm not talking about his second coming.
Én nem a második eljöveteléről beszélek.
I'm talking about the Day of Atonement.
Én a nagy engesztelési napról beszélek.
Could the Day of Atonement or the close of probation
Lehetséges, hogy a nagy engesztelési napot, vagyis a kegyelemidő végét, lezárulását
be on the seventh month of the 10th day of some year?
valamelyik év 7. hónapjának 10. napján legyen? Lehetséges ez?
Now I know that no prophecy is of private interpretation.
Tudom, hogy egyetlen profécia sem támad saját magyarázatból.
And I'm not telling you this is the way it's going to be.
És azt sem akarom lefektetni, hogy már pedig így lesz.
But this is the only thing I have to go by.
De ez az egyetlen, amire támaszkodhatok.
Every one of the spring feasts was fulfilled to the letter on the day.
Az tavaszi ünnepek mindegyike betűre és napra pontosan teljesedett.
So what am I supposed to think of the fall feasts?
Akkor mit kellene gondolnom az őszi ünnepekről?
They have to do with the harvest.
Ami az aratáshoz kötődik,
The harvest hasn't occurred yet.
mert az aratás még nem történt meg.
The blowing of the trumpets.
A kürtzengés,
The Day of Atonement.
a nagy engesztelési nap,
And the Feast of Tabernacles.
és a sátoros ünnep.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about these this afternoon.
Szeretnék ezekről beszélni még délután is.
There were two more feasts.
Volt még 2 ünnep,
One occurred every 7 years.
az egyik minden 7. évben ismétlődött.
It was the year of rest and release.
Ez az elengedés és a megnyugvás éve volt.
The land would rest.
A föld pihent, megnyugodott.
It was also a time of release.
Ez egyúttal az elengedés éve is volt,
If you were a Jewish slave,
mert ha valaki zsidó rabszolga volt,
you were set free if you had a Jewish owner.
hogy akkor azt szabadon engedték, hogyha zsidó volt az ura.
The next feast only occurred once every 50 years.
A következő ünnep az egyszer volt 50 évenként.
It was the year of Jubilee.
Ez a jubileum volt.
And on the year of Jubilee, everyone was set free.
És a jubileum ünnepén mindenki megszabadult.
It didn't matter if you were a Jew or a Gentile.
Független attól, hogy valaki zsidó volt, vagy nem zsidó.
If you were amongst God's people and in God's land, you were set free.
Ha Isten népe között voltál, az ő földjén, akkor felszabadultál.
Now, an interesting thing about these two yearly feasts
Ezeknek az éves ünnepeknek, vagy évekhez kötődő ünnepeknek az érdekessége,
is that you were not set free until the Feast of Tabernacles.
Hogy ez a szabadon engedés csak a sátoros ünnepen történt.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the trumpets.
Szeretnék néhány szót szólni a kürtökről, vagy a kürtszengésről.
When you look up trumpets in the Bible,
Hogyha kikeressük ezt a témát a Bibliából, a kürtök,
you'll find that the trumpets were blown basically for 4 different things.
akkor azt találjuk, hogy 4 különböző dolog miatt kürtöltek.
One was when they were following the cloud in the wilderness.
Az egyik ilyen, az ahhoz kötődött, amikor a pusztában vándoroltak, és követték a felhőt, ami előttük járt.
And they blew a trumpet, and a tribe knew it was time for them to move.
És minden egyes kürt fúváskor az egyik törzs felkelt és elindult.
But the main reason the trumpets were blown was for 3 reasons.
Ez volt az egyik ok, de van 3 másik ok, ami a fő okai voltak, hogy miért fújtak kürtöt.
One was a warning message.
Tehát az egyik oka az, hogy kürtöt fújtak, az, hogy ez figyelmeztető üzenet volt.
2 was a call to battle.
Másodszorban azért, hogyha harcba hívták az embereket.
And 3 was a gathering of the people.
És harmadrészt, hogyha egybegyűjtötték a népet.
Again, the first of the fall feasts was the blowing of the trumpets.
Tehát az őszi ünnepek között az első az a kürtszengés ünnepe.
I guess I would associate with that a warning message.
Azt gondolom, hogy ez egy figyelmeztető üzenetet jelent.
Right before the Day of Atonement, what kind of warning message do you suppose that might be?
Közvetlenül a nagy engesztelési nap előtt mit gondoltok, milyen figyelmeztető üzenet szól?
I don't know, I think it might be the final message to mankind.
Nem tudom, de azt gondolom, hogy az emberiséghez szóló utolsó üzenetről van szó.
A call to battle.
Ez egy háborúba vagy harcba hívó üzenet.
Can't wait till you read Joel chapter 2.
Már alig várom, hogy elolvashassuk Joel 2-t.
And the gathering of the people.
És összegyűjtik a népet.
The trumpets were blown in the fall feasts.
A kürtök az őszi ünnepek idején szólaltak meg.
To warn the people that the Day of Atonement was near.
Azért, hogy figyelmeztessék az embereket, hogy eljött a nagy engesztelési nap, közel van.
On the Day of Atonement,
a nagy engesztelési napon
God's people were to afflict themselves.
Isten népének meg kellett sanyargatnia önmagát.
Talked a little bit about that yesterday with respect to the investigative judgment.
Tegnap már érintettük ezt a vizsgálati ítélettel kapcsolatban.
On the Day of Atonement, the sealing is complete.
A nagy engesztelési napon befejeződik az elpecsételés.
Michael stands up.
Felkel Mikael.
And there is the close of probation.
És lezárul a kegyelemidő.
Pretty significant events.
Rendkívül fontos események.
You know, our pioneers had an urgency in 1844.
Tudjuk jól, hogy az úttörőink nagyon sürgetve érezték magukat 1844-ben.
They went through an experience very much like the disciples did in the time of Jesus.
Nagyon hasonló tapasztalaton mentek át, mint a tanítványok Jézus idejében.
But God convicted them.
Isten volt az, aki ezt a meggyőződést helyezte beléjük.
In their minds they believed that Jesus was going to come on October 22nd.
És teljesen meg voltak róla győződve, hogy Jézus el fog jönni október 22-én 1844-ben.
What would that do to you if you knew Jesus was going to come in just a few days?
Mit tenne ez veled, hogyha te tudnád biztosan, hogy Jézus pár nap múlva el fog jönni?
I don't think you'd be sitting here listening to me.
Azt gondolom, hogy nem itt ülnél, hogy rám hallgassál.
You'd be desperate.
Elkeseredett lennél.
To know, am I all right with Christ?
És mindent megmozgatnál, hogy megtudd, hogy rendben vagyok-e Krisztussal.
If you have children or grandchildren,
Hogyha gyerekeid vagy unokáid vannak,
you'd be going to them begging and pleading that they would accept Jesus now.
oda mennél hozzájuk könyörögve, hogy fogadják el Jézust most.
Your friends, your neighbors,
A barátaid, a szomszédaid,
anyone who you came across.
mindenki, akivel csak találkozol.
You would be fanatical.
Fanatikus lennél.
Imagine
Képzeld csak el,
if you knew when the day of probation was closing.
ha tudnád, mely napon zárul le a kegyelemidő.
The disciples knew Jesus was the Son of God.
A tanítványok tudták, hogy Jézus Isten fia.
There was a great excitement. They thought that Jesus was going to become king of the world.
Nagyon lelkesedtek ezért, mert azt gondolták, hogy Jézus lesz a világ királya.
Their interpretation of the prophecies was close.
Was closed?
Was close.
Close. Tehát a profécia értelmezésük nagyon közel állt a valósághoz,
But they were wrong just a little bit.
de egy ponton elvétették.
And when Jesus died, even though he told them he was going to die,
És amikor Jézus meghalt, annak ellenére, hogy Jézus mondta nekik, hogy meg fog halni,
they went through a great disappointment.
rettenetes csalódáson kellett keresztül menniük.
Those who came out of that disappointment stirred the world.
De azok, akik átmentek ezen a csalódáson, az egész világot megrendítették.
Our pioneers, when they studied the prophecies,
A mi úttörőink is, amikor a proféciákat tanulmányozták,
it stirred the world.
megrendítették ezzel a világot.
They were close,
Nagyon közel jártak a valósághoz,
but they made a mistake.
de ők is elkövettek egy hibát.
And they went through a great disappointment.
És ezzel egy nagy emiatt egy nagy csalódáson kellett keresztül menniük.
Whenever we study these things, we have to be careful.
Tehát amikor ezeket a dolgokat tanulmányozzuk, óvatosságra kell, hogy intsük magunkat.
We must watch unto prayer.
Vigyázzunk és imádkozzunk.
Chances are we're going to make a mistake when we study prophecy.
Elképzelhető, hogy tévedünk, amikor a proféciákat tanulmányozzuk.
And if a mistake is made,
És hogyha tévedünk,
no matter what, hold on to Jesus.
akkor nem probléma, csak ragaszkodjunk végig Jézushoz.
The disciples, they were afraid. They ran away,
A tanítványok féltek, elfutottak,
but they held on to their belief.
de mégis
Christ.
ragaszkodtak a Krisztusba vetett hitükhöz.
Our pioneers were discouraged and ridiculed.
Az úttörőink teljesen elcsüggedtek és gúnyolták is őket.
But they held on to Christ.
De ragaszkodtak továbbra is Krisztushoz.
And in the end, Christ lifted them up.
És végül Krisztus felemelte őket.
So, this afternoon when we go over some of these things,
Ma délután tovább tanulmányozzuk még ezeket.
I'm not trying to tell you that this is the way it's going to be.
És nem akarom azt mondani, hogy már pedig így is így lesznek a dolgok.
As a matter of fact, I'd like you to look into them too. also.
Valójában azt szeretném, hogy ti is tanulmányozzátok ezeket a dolgokat.
Because you might find some things that I am not seeing.
Mert lehet, hogy ti is találtok olyan dolgokat, amiket én még most nem látok.
The final feast was the Feast of Tabernacles.
De térjünk rá az utolsó ünnepre, a sátoros ünnepre.
It was to be a reminder of their time in tents.
Ez egy olyan ünnep volt, ami emlékeztette őket arra, hogy valaha sátorokban laktak.
Or their experience in the wilderness.
A pusztai tapasztalatukra.
We're having a wilderness experience right now.
Nekünk is van most egy pusztai tapasztalatunk.
It was to be a time of rejoicing and deliverance.
Ez egy örömünnep volt, a szabadulás ünnepe.
And it was to be after the gathering of the land, or the harvest.
És mindez az aratás után volt. Tehát a föld összegyűjtése után volt.
So it's interesting, there's a warning message, Day of Trumpets.
Tehát nagyon érdekes a sorrend, hogy van először egy figyelmeztető üzenet, a kürcengés.
The Feast of Tabernacles was not to be kept until after the gathering of the harvest.
A sátoros ünnepet nem tartották meg, csak az aratás után.
Is there any gathering of the harvest after the Day of Atonement?
Van még az engesztelés után aratás, vagy az aratásnak a begyűjtése?
Will there be any gathering of souls after Jesus stands up?
Lesz még lélekgyűjtés azután, hogy Jézus feláll?
But 5 days after the close of probation
De van itt 5 nap a próbaidő lezárulása után
is the Feast of Tabernacles.
a sátoros ünnepig.
Very interesting.
Ez nagyon érdekes.
What is going to happen during this Feast of Tabernacles?
Mi történik ezen a sátoros ünnepen?
I just wanted to put some of these things in your mind.
Csak szerettem volna ezeket feleleveníteni a gondolataitokban.
If you would like the scriptures where all these feast days are, I can give them to you.
Hogyha szeretnétek elolvasni ezeket az igéket az ünnepkörről, szívesen elmondom, hogy hol találjátok.
This afternoon I would like to look at prophecy.
De ma délután szeretnék proféciákról beszélni.
I'm not sure why,
Nem tudom miért.
but for some reason I can't get these things out of my mind.
Nem tudom ezeket a dolgokat kitessékelni a gondolataim közül.
I know that we're drawing close to the end of time.
Tudom, hogy nagyon közel vagyunk a vég idejéhez, az idő végéhez.
The message of Christ and his righteousness is coming to the forefront.
Krisztus és az ő igazságosságának üzenete előkerül és előre nyomul.
Maybe it's time once again to look at what's going to happen in the near future.
És talán itt van az ideje annak is, hogy megnézzük, hogy mi fog történni a közeljövőben.
Okay?
Rendben?
Let's pray.
Imádkozzunk. Mennyi Atyánk, köszönjük neked, hogy te feltártad előttünk a te titkaidat. Köszönjük neked, hogy azok az ünnepek, amik Jézusra mutattak, azok mind szóról szóra beteljesedtek, napra pontosan is. Köszönjük, hogy te mindezeket azért osztod meg velünk. Ugye, ahogy Jézus mondta, hogy amikor megvannak, akkor higgyünk, mert te a mi hitünket akarod erősíteni. Ó, Atyánk, köszönjük, hogy a prófétai szó az valóban világító szövétnek a mi lépteink előtt. Tudjuk azt, hogy annyi hibát ejthetünk emberekként is, látjuk a mi elődeinket is, akár a tanítványokat, vagy az advent úttörőket, hogy sok hibát ejtettek ők is, és ezért csalódtak. Mennyi Atyánk, köszönjük neked azt, hogy te minden segítséget megadsz, és kérünk, hogy adj nekünk alázatos és kutató szívet, hogy valóban keressük a te akaratodat, és te ki tud nekünk jelenteni, hogy amikor eljön az idő, akkor ne kelljen csalódnunk, hanem a mi hitünk hatalmasan megerősödjön a te igéd által, és a prófétai szó által. Köszönjük, hogy te ebben megsegítesz minket, a te dicsőségedért és a te fiad nevéért. Amen.
Well, every good teacher
mint ahogy minden jó tanár
will always ask when class resumes.
Mindig kérdez, amikor a tanóra folytatódik.
How many of you did your homework?
Hányan végeztétek el a házi feladatot?
All right.
Ah, there's a hand.
I got a hand.
Na, van egy felemelt kéz.
All right. Well, you can turn to the book of Joel.
Lapozzuk fel tehát Joel könyvét,
And you can pretty well just keep it open to that spot.
és nyugodtan itt is maradhatunk végig.
Even if we go to another scripture, you can keep your finger there because we'll be coming right back.
Mert fel fogunk idézni más igehelyeket is, de mindig visszatérünk ide Joel könyvéhez.
We talked this morning a little bit about the feast days.
Ma délelőtt beszéltünk az ünnepekről.
And we saw that how in the spring feasts,
Láttuk azt, hogy a tavaszi ünnepekben
every single one of them was fulfilled to the letter on the day.
minden egyes ünnep napra és betűre pontosan beteljesedett.
Whether it be the death of Christ on the cross,
Akár Krisztus kereszthaláláról van szó,
or his glorification on the day of Pentecost,
vagy a pünkösd napján való megdicsőüléséről,
the waving of the wave sheaf,
a zsengekéve meglóbálásáról,
and the removal of sin,
a bűn eltávolításáról.
were all fulfilled by Christ to the letter on the day in the year that he died.
Krisztus ezeket mind betűre és napra pontosan betöltötte abban az évben, amikor meghalt.
In Great Controversy, Ellen White writes,
A Nagy Küzdelem című könyvében Ellen White a következőt írja.
she says, these types were fulfilled not only as to the event, but as to the time.
Azt mondja, hogy ezek a... segíts már. Type. Előképek. Ezek az előképek beteljesedtek, de nem csak az esemény szintjén, hanem az időt tekintve is.
Then she goes on to say that on the 14th of Nisan,
Ezután azt mondja, hogy a Nisan 14-én
that the Lamb of God was slain to take away the sins of the world.
Levágták az Isten bárányát, hogy elvegye a világ bűneit.
She talks about the rest of the feast days being fulfilled to the letter on the day.
Utána pedig arról beszél, hogy a többi ünnepnap is napra és betűre pontosan beteljesedett.
Then she says, in like manner, the types which relate to the second advent must be fulfilled at the time appointed out in the symbolic service.
És ezután, miután ezekről beszél, hozzáteszi, hasonlóképpen azok az előképek, amelyek a második adventtel kapcsolatosak, beteljesednek abban az időben, amelyet a jelképes szolgálat megjelölt.
So she says, in the same way that the spring feasts were fulfilled to the letter in the day.
Azt mondja itt, hogy ugyanazon a módon, mint ahogy a tavaszi ünnepek beteljesedtek, napra pontosan.
She says, in like manner, they will be fulfilled at the time appointed, called out in the symbolic service.
Hasonlóképpen a meghatározott időben, tehát a jelképes szolgálat által meghatározott időben, a Krisztus második eljövetelének idejében is be fognak teljesedni azok az ünnepek.
Now for me that's very exciting.
Számomra ez egy nagyon izgalmas gondolat.
Because we have specific months and specific days called out in those feasts.
Mert ezeknek az ünnepeknek meghatározott idejük van, hónapra és napra pontosan meghatározott idejük.
The fall feast was the Feast of Trumpets.
Az őszi ünnepek, ugye a kürcengés ünnepe,
The Day of Atonement,
az engesztelési nap,
and the Feast of Tabernacles.
és a sátoros ünnep.
The Feast of Trumpets was on the 7th month of the first day of that month.
A kürcengés ünnepe a 7. hónap első napján volt.
So according to what Ellen White said,
Hát Ellen White-tot, hogyha alapul vesszük,
and just like in the time of Jesus,
tudnélik, hogy ugyanúgy, mint ahogy Jézus idejében,
something very significant is going to happen on the first day of the seventh month of some year.
valamely évünk 7. hónapjának első napján valami rendkívüli esemény fog történni.
We have the month.
Itt van a hónap.
We have the day.
És a nap.
Does anybody know the year?
Tudja valaki az évet?
Me neither.
Én sem tudom.
Yet.
Még.
The Day of Atonement.
Aztán jön az engesztelési nap.
Now, this one we know very well.
Ezt nagyon jól ismerjük.
We as Adventists have studied it and looked into it many times.
Adventistákként nagyon sokat tanulmányoztuk, vizsgáltuk ezt.
Leviticus chapter 16.
3 Mózes 16-ból például.
Afflicting our souls.
Megsanyargatni a mi lelkünket.
The close of probation.
A kegyelemidő lezárulása.
This is a very significant day.
Ez egy nagyon jelentőségteljes nap.
10 days after the Feast of Trumpets.
10 nappal a kürtzengés után.
It's the Day of Atonement.
Ekkor van a nagy engesztelési nap.
On the 7th month, the 10th day.
A 7. hónap 10. napján.
Man, if we knew what year.
Hú, hát hogyha tudhatnánk, hogy melyik évben van ez.
If you knew what year this was.
Ha tudhatnánk, hogy melyik évben van ez a nagy engesztelési nap.
What would that do to you?
Mit tenne ez veled?
We talked earlier today what that did to our pioneers when they thought Jesus was coming on October 22nd, 1844.
Délelőtt már említettem azt, hogy a mi úttörőinkkel mit tett ez, amikor ők ezt megértették, hogy Jézus Krisztus október 22-én 1844-ben fog visszajönni.
It's a very serious thought if we knew when this day was coming.
Ez egy rendkívül komoly gondolat, hogy belegondolunk abba, hogy mikor van ez a nap.
5 days later, after the close of probation.
5 nappal a próbaidő vagy kegyelemidő lezárulása után
Is the Feast of Tabernacles.
akkor van a sátoros ünnep.
This feast was to go on for 7 days.
Ennek az ünnepnek 7 napon át kellett zajlania.
The people were to wave the palm branches.
Az emberek pálmaágakat lengettek,
And they were to live in booths or tents.
és sátrakban kellett lakniuk.
It was a reminder of their sojourn in the wilderness.
Emlékeztetőül arra, hogy a pusztaságban vándoroltak.
It was also a sign that the harvest had been pulled in.
Továbbá annak is mindenkori emlékeztetője volt, hogy megtörtént az aratás.
Now it's very interesting that there are 3 times a year God asked for his people to be gathered in.
Érdekes módon egy évben Isten 3 alkalmat jelölt meg, amikor az ő népét egybe kellett gyűjteni.
The first one was on the day of the Passover when Jesus died.
Az első ilyen az a Páska ünnepe volt, amikor Jézus meghalt.
God said that all the males of Israel were to come to Jerusalem on that day.
Isten megparancsolta, hogy Izraelben minden férfiúnak el kell jönni Jeruzsálembe ezen a napon.
God knew what was going to happen.
Isten pontosan tudta, hogy mi fog történni.
At the time Jesus went to the cross,
Azon a napon, amikor Jézus a keresztre ment,
the Jews were scattered all over the world.
de abban az időben a zsidók mindenfelé szét voltak szóródva a világban.
God in his infinite wisdom wanted as many of them from all over the world to be in Jerusalem on the day that Jesus was hanging on the cross.
Isten az ő végtelen bölcsességében úgy intézte, hogy a lehető legtöbb zsidó ott lehessen azon a napon Jeruzsálemben, amikor Jézus a kereszten függött.
Jews from Rome and Greece and Athens.
Zsidók Rómából, Görögországból, Aténből, mindenhonnan.
There were millions and millions of people in Jerusalem at this time.
Több millió zsidó volt Jeruzsálemben ebben az időben.
And they all knew what was going on.
És mindenki tudta, hogy mik történnek.
This young man from Nazareth
Itt van ez az ifjú prédikátor Názáretből.
was healing and teaching.
Gyógyít, meg tanít.
Miracles.
Csodák történnek.
Some people came with an expectation of possibly meeting him or even being healed.
Egyesek talán azzal a várakozással jöttek, hogy találkozhatnak vele, vagy akár meg is gyógyulhatnak.
I'm sure that if they would have had newspapers, Jesus would have been on the front page.
Azt gondolom, hogy ha abban az időben lettek volna újságok, akkor Jézus biztos címlapsztori lett volna.
But when they got there,
De amikor odaértek,
he was hanging on a cross.
a kereszten függött.
It was the day of the Passover.
Ez a Páska ünnepe volt.
I'm sure it made them all think.
Azt gondolom, hogy mindjárt elgondolkodtak rajta.
The next feast that all of the men children of Israel were to be in Jerusalem
A következő ünnep, amelyen Izrael férfiainak ismét meg kellett jelennie,
was on the day of Pentecost.
az pünkösdnapja volt.
Here again, God in his infinite wisdom
Itt ekkor ismét Isten az ő végtelen bölcsességében,
he knew what was going to happen.
melyel pontosan tudta, hogy mi fog történni.
Christ was glorified.
Krisztus megdicsőült,
He poured out of himself to his people.
ki árasztotta önmagát az ő népére,
When the Spirit of God came upon them and they came out of that upper room,
és az Isten lelke kiáradt a tanítványokra, és kijöttek a felházból,
they began to preach Christ and him crucified.
elkezdték prédikálni a Krisztust, mint megfeszítettet.
They spoke in tongues,
Nyelveken szóltak.
in the languages of all the people that had come from all over the world.
Mindazokon a nyelveken, amit azok beszéltek, azok a zsidók, akik a világ különböző tájairól jöttek.
Thousands were converted in one day.
Több ezren tértek meg naponta.
They were Jews.
Zsidók.
All they had to do was to ascend to the knowledge that Jesus was the Son of God.
Tehát csak annyit kellett elfogadniuk, hogy Jézus Krisztus, ő az Isten fia.
And many of them went back to the countries from which they came.
És nagyon sokan ezután visszatértek azokba az országokba, ahonnan jöttek.
And told the news of what they saw in Jerusalem when they went up to the feast.
És elmondták a történetet, hogy mit tapasztaltak ott Jeruzsálemben ezen az ünnepen.
And years later, when Paul came through on his missionary journeys,
És amikor Pál apostol a missziós útjain járt,
he always went to the Jewish synagogues first.
először mindig a zsidó zsinagógákba ment el.
And there were always Jews that were ready to accept Christ.
És mindig találkozott olyan zsidókkal, akik készek voltak elfogadni Krisztust.
And then persecution came.
De aztán jött az üldözés,
He was cast out of the synagogues,
kivetették Pált a zsinagógából,
and he took the gospel to the Gentiles.
és ezután a pogányokhoz fordult az evangéliummal.
God in his infinite wisdom said that on the day of the Feast of Tabernacles,
Isten az ő végtelen bölcsességében azt mondta, hogy a sátorok ünnepén
all of Israel was to appear before the Lord on that day.
megint az egész Izraelnek meg kell jelenni az Úr előtt.
Just makes you think.
Elgondolkodtató.
In the book of Joel, chapter 1,
Jóel könyve első fejezetében
we seem to be given a little bit of a history of what happens to God's people.
kapunk egy kis betekintést Isten népének, vagyis Izraelnek történelmébe.
A few years ago, Brother David preached a sermon on Joel chapter 1.
Nem olyan régen, pár évvel ezelőtt David beszélt erről egy előadásában az első fejezetről, tehát Jóel 1-ről.
I'll never forget it. I was in Jamaica.
Soha nem felejtem el, akkor éppen Jamaikában voltam.
And I was so fascinated by his interpretation of what was going on in chapter 1.
És annyira megdöbbentett mindaz, amit itt olvastam az első fejezetben, és ahogy ő ezt magyarázta.
For I was studying some prophecies in Daniel with respect to the daily.
Mert én éppen akkor néhány proféciát tanulmányoztam Dániel könyvéből a mindennapival kapcsolatban.
I think I even came here and gave a sermon on the daily a few years ago.
Yes. És 2 évvel ezelőtt, amikor itt voltam, akkor meg is osztottam veletek ezt, amire jutottam a mindennapival kapcsolatban.
I was so surprised because in my study of the daily,
annyira meglepődtem, mert a mindennapival kapcsolatos tanulmányomban
I was led to the daily sacrifice.
A mindennapi áldozatra terelődött a figyelmem.
The morning and the evening sacrifice it's referred to.
Az esti és reggeli áldozatra.
Because in the daily sacrifice, a lamb was slain every morning and every evening.
A mindennapi áldozatban egy bárányt áldoztak reggel és egyet este.
And I knew that typified Jesus.
És megértettem ebből, hogy ez Jézust jelképezi.
We're told that every morning and every evening.
Azt mondja ez, hogy minden reggel, minden este
We men, as the head of our households,
mi férfiak, mint a családunk fejei,
are to gather our families every morning and every evening.
Össze kell gyűjtsük a családunkat minden reggel és minden este,
and we are to dedicate them to the Lord.
És az Úrnak kell szentelnünk őket.
As I contemplated the daily, I saw a really nice, clear picture of Jesus.
Amikor így a mindennapiról gondolkodtam, egy csodálatos, tiszta kép tárult fel előttem Jézusról.
And in Daniel chapter 8, it talks about the daily being removed.
Viszont Dániel könyve 8. fejezetében azt írja, hogy elvétetik a mindennapi.
And I thought, if this daily sacrifice was removed,
és ezen gondolkodtam, hogy ha el van véve, hogy elvétetik ez a mindennapi áldozat,
it would be like Jesus being removed from in front of the people's eyes.
Ez olyan, mintha Jézust elvennék az emberek szeme elől.
Even in the book of Daniel prayed 3 times a day.
Dániel könyvében is azt látjuk, hogy Dániel naponta 3-szor imádkozott.
2 of those times he got down and he prayed toward Jerusalem. És
ezek közül 2 alkalommal Jeruzsálem felé fordulva imádkozott.
At the time of the morning and the evening sacrifice.
Az reggeli és az esti áldozat idején.
Satan is doing everything in his power to try to hide Jesus from our view.
Sátán mindent megtesz, ami a hatalmában áll, hogy Jézust kizárja a látóterünkből.
For he knows that when Jesus is removed from our view, we're weak.
Mert tudja azt, hogy ha nem látjuk Jézust, akkor gyengék vagyunk.
Just like Peter when he walked on the water.
Úgy, mint ahogy Péter is, amikor vízen járt.
As long as he kept his eyes fixed on Christ, he could do the impossible.
Mindaddig, amíg a tekintetét Jézusra szegezte, képes volt a lehetetlenre.
But the minute he took his eyes off of Christ, he began to sink.
De abban a pillanatban, hogy levette róla a tekintetét, süllyedni kezdett.
We all know this.
Mindnyájan tudjuk ezt.
That's why the devil tries to preoccupy our minds all throughout the day.
Ezért próbálja az ördög minden dologgal lekötni a mi gondolatainkat egész nap.
I'm going to say this straight out.
Hadd mondjam ezt nyíltan.
One of the reasons we don't have more of Christ in here.
Az egyik oka annak, hogy nincsen bennünk több a Krisztusból,
is because of our worldliness.
A mi világiasságunk.
No matter what it is, our jobs.
Nem számít, hogy miről van szó. Munkahely.
Our cares, our perplexities with respect to this world.
Az aggodalmaink, ami ezzel a világgal kapcsolatos.
The things that we love, even our family.
Akár azok a dolgok is, amiket szeretnek, lehet az a családunk is.
Anything that causes you to lose your focus of Christ for an extended period of time.
Mindazok a dolgok, amelyek elvonják a tekintetünket, a figyelmünket Krisztusról hosszabb időre,
makes you weak.
Az gyengít.
That's why we've been warned. Be careful what we look upon.
Ezért kaptunk figyelmeztetéseket, hogy vigyázz, hogy mire tekintesz.
Be careful what we listen to.
Vigyázz, hogy mit hallgatsz.
Be careful what you touch.
Vigyázz, hogy mit illetsz, mit érintesz.
Be careful what you taste.
Vigyázz, hogy mit ízlelsz.
Anything that causes us to indulge self.
Bármi, ami arra késztet, hogy az énünknek kedvezzünk,
Causes self to be lifted up.
az az énünket emeli fel.
And Christ to be pushed to the side.
Krisztus pedig eltaszítja.
We're learning wonderful things about Christ in you, the hope of glory.
Csodálatos dolgokat tanulunk erről, hogy Krisztus ti bennetek, a dicsőségnek a reménysége.
But when Jesus is taken from our view, we are weak.
De abban a pillanatban, hogy Jézus elvétetik a mi tekintetünk elől, gyengék vagyunk.
Well, another thing with respect to the daily,
A mindennapival kapcsolatban még egy dolog van.
the priest would offer a meat and a drink offering every morning and every evening.
A pap emellett, a bárány mellett egy ételáldozatot és egy italáldozatot is felajánlott reggel és este is.
If you read Joel chapter 1,
Ha elolvassuk Jóel könyve első fejezetét,
you will see that locusts and palmer worms and all these insects come and they devastate the land.
azt látjuk ebben a fejezetben, hogy mindenféle kártevő, sáska, meg cserebogár, meg hernyó, meg mindezek feljöttek Izrael földjére, és mindent elpusztítottak.
We have always understood the locusts in Revelation in the time of the trumpets to be armies.
A sáskákkal kapcsolatban Jelenések könyvét tanulmányozva ezeket mindig seregekként értelmeztük.
In the Old Testament, when armies came against God's people, they were devastated.
Amikor hatalmas seregek jöttek az Ószövetségben Izrael népe ellen, akkor nagyon sokszor óriási pusztításokat okoztak.
In the time of Gideon,
Gedeon idejében például
he was threshing the wheat in secret
ő titokban csépelte a gabonát,
because the Midianites had basically wiped out all their crops to keep them subservient.
mert a midianiták elpusztították a gabonájukat, hogy szolgasságban tarthassák őket.
This is a prophetic view of what has happened to us since the papacy has come on the scene.
Ez egy profétikus kép annak, hogy mi történt velünk azóta, hogy a pápaság fellépett a színre.
These pests are referred to as the Northern Army, as you'll see a little bit later.
Ahogy itt későbbiekben írja, ezek a kártevők az északi seregként vannak említve.
The Northern Army always represented what kind of power in ancient Israel?
Az északi sereg az ősi Izrael történetében mindig milyen hatalmat jelképezett?
I heard it. Babylon.
Babilon.
Babylon. Babylon has laid us waste.
Babilon elpusztított bennünket.
As a result of the false doctrine of the Trinity.
A Szent Háromság hamis tanának eredményeképp.
False days of worship.
Hamis ünnepnapok miatt.
False justification.
Hamis megigazulás.
False sanctification.
Hamis megszentelődés.
I mean, the list is so... false judgment. Hellfire.
Hamis ítélet, pokoltűz. Lehet sorolni a listát.
And everyone in this room has been impacted by all that nonsense.
És közülünk mindnyájunkra hatással volt és van ez a ostobaság gyűjtemény.
And as a result, Jesus has been removed from the view of his people.
És ennek eredményeképp Jézus elvétetett az ő népének tekintete elől.
We've been like little animals herded off into these little cages called denominations.
Mint oktalan állatokat betereltek bennünket ezekbe a kis ketrecekbe, amiket felekezeteknek neveznek.
Where we're told what to think.
Ahol megmondják nekünk, hogy hogy kell gondolkodnunk, mit kell gondolnunk.
What to believe.
Mit kell hinnünk.
And if you don't follow the herd,
és hogyha nem követed a nyájat,
you'll be cast out to the wolves where you'll lose your life.
Akkor kivetnek téged a farkasok közé, ahol elveszted az életedet is.
Well, God's people have been laid waste so bad.
Isten népe között akkora nagy a pusztítás,
Notice what it says in verse 9 of chapter 1.
hogy az első fejezet 9. verse így írja le.
It says, the meat offering and the drink offering is cut off from the house of the Lord.
Jóel 1.9. Kifogyott az étel és italáldozat az Úrnak házából.
Verse 13, it says it again, gird yourselves and lament, ye priests, and howl, ye ministers of the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, ye ministers of my God. For the meat offering and the drink offering is withholden from the house of God.
13. versben megint mondja, öltsetek gyászt és sírjatok ti papok, jajgassatok ti oltárszolgái, jöjjetek és háljatok gyászruhákban Istenem szolgái, mert megvonatott az étel és italáldozat Isteneteknek házától.
This infestation that has occurred amongst God's people.
Ez a infestation.
Plague.
Tehát ez a betegség, vagy ez a kártétel, ami Isten népére így kihatott,
has eaten everything we need to survive.
Mindent felemésztett, ami a túléléshez szükséges.
In the ancient system, what was the meat and the drink offering?
Az ősi rendszerben mi volt az étel és az italáldozat?
The meat offering was a food offering.
Yes, this is the same.
Okay.
Food.
The food offering was wheat.
Tehát az ételáldozat az búza volt,
and oil.
És olaj.
And burned on the fire.
És ez összekeverve és elégetve a tűzben.
The drink offering was wine.
Az italáldozat az pedig bor volt.
The priest would take the wheat and the oil and he would burn it on the fire.
A pap fogta a búzát és az olajat és megégette a tűzben.
And this is the part I like the best. The drink offering was taken in before the altar in the holy place.
És hát a másik része az számomra legkedvesebb. Az italáldozatot viszont bevitték az oltárhoz, a szentélybe.
And it was poured out before the Lord.
És az Úr előtt kitöltötték.
Remember, the daily sacrifice was performed in behalf of God's people.
A mindennapi áldozatot ne feledjük el, Isten népe javára végezték, ő értük végezték.
Jesus left us he left us two ceremonies.
Jézus Krisztus 2 szertartást hagyott nekünk.
Baptism.
A keresztséget.
And Holy Communion.
És az úrvacsorai közösséget.
By God's grace we're going to be partaking of Holy Communion this week.
Isten kegyelméből a héten is részesülünk úrvacsorából.
And I want you to think on those two emblems for a moment.
De szeretném, hogyha meggondolnánk most ezt a két jelképet.
One of them is the meat offering and one of them is the drink offering.
Az egyik az ételáldozat, és a másik az italáldozat.
If I take flour and oil, mix it together and I cook it, what do I get?
Hogyha veszek lisztet és olajat, összekeverem és megsütöm, akkor mit kapok?
Unleavened bread.
Kovásztalan kenyeret.
And when I drink, what am I getting? I'm getting wine.
És amit iszok, akkor mit iszok? Bort, vagy illetve mustot.
Those emblems are designed to point us to Christ.
Ezek a jelképek, mind Krisztusra mutatnak, így lettek tervezve.
Some of you may have been taking communion your whole life.
Lehet, hogy közületek néhányan vettetek úrvacsorát ugyan egész életetekben mindig.
And we're just now learning that Christ himself can dwell inside this body.
És csak most hallotok arról, hogy Krisztus maga akar és tud a ti testetekben élni.
Those emblems have been showing us that we have been taking Christ in always, but we've been blinded to it.
Ezek a jelképek, ezek pontosan erről szólnak, hogy Krisztus bennünk akar lakozni, de mi ezt nem fogtuk fel, mert vakok voltunk.
It was always designed to show us what Christ did for us.
Mindig azt akarták nekünk ezek megmutatni, hogy mi az, amit Krisztus megtett értünk.
Shedding his body and his blood.
Odadva az ő testét, kiontva az ő vérét értünk.
And it was to help us to have faith in what he would do in us.
hogy hitünk legyen abban, amit ő bennünk kíván elvégezni.
When we take part of him internally.
Amikor ami bensünkben részesülünk belőle.
Well, here it says that the meat offering and the drink offering has been removed from God's people.
De itt Jóel egyben azt írja, hogy az étel és az ital áldozat elvétetett Isten népétől.
What was David talking about when he was talking about the kingdom of heaven?
Miről beszélt itt Dávid, amikor a menny királyságáról beszélt?
The amazing thing of the New Testament gospel.
Az új szövetségi evangéliumnak az elképesztő igazsága ez.
Is Christ in you the hope of glory?
Krisztus ti bennetek az dicsőségnek a reménysége.
This is what we've been learning over these past few years.
Az elmúlt néhány évben ezekről tanultunk.
And tell me, what denomination out there really believes that Jesus dwells in here?
Melyik ugyanaz a felekezet, amelyik valóban hiszi, hogy Jézus itt bennünk él?
None of them.
Egyik sem.
Jesus has been removed from the view of the people.
Jézus elvétetett az emberek tekintete elől.
They're looking for salvation from somebody other than Jesus.
Más valakire tekintenek, vagy más valamikre tekintenek az üdvösségért, és nem Jézusra.
Even in the Adventist church, our pioneers would roll over in their graves.
Hát
American expression. Roll over in your graves.
Yes. For what?
If they knew what Adventists had become.
Tehát ma is az adventista úttörőink forognának a sírjukban, hogyha tudnák, hogy hova jutott az adventizmus.
They didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity.
Ők például nem hittek a Szent Háromságtanban.
Today in America they're praying to the Holy Spirit.
Ma Amerikában odáig jutottak, hogy a Szent Lélekhez imádkoznak.
God's people have been laid waste.
Isten népét elpusztították.
It is going to be our job to restore the oil, the wheat and the wine.
A mi feladatunk helyreállítani az olajat, a bort, a gabonát.
If you go to verse 14. Chapter 1, verse 14.
Jóel 1, 14. versét, hogyha megnézzük.
It says, sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God, and cry unto the Lord, alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand, and as a destruction from the Almighty it shall come.
Tehát 14-15-ben ezt mondja, szenteljetek böjtöt, hirdessetek gyűlést, gyűjtsétek egybe a véneket, a földnek minden lakosát az Úrnak, a ti isteneteknek házába, és kiáltsatok az Úrhoz. Jaj, ez a nap, bizony közel van az Úrnak napja, és mint a pusztítás úgy jön el a mindenhatótól.
The day of the Lord is at hand, the time of the harvest.
Közel van az Úrnak napja, az aratás ideje.
Come down to chapter 2, verse 1.
Nézzük meg második fejezet első versét.
The first verse says, blow ye the trumpet in Zion. Sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand.
Ezt mondja, fújjatok kürtöt a Sionon, és rivalgjatok az én szent hegyemen. Rémüljenek meg a föld minden lakói, mert eljön az Úrnak napja, mert közel van az.
What does nigh at hand mean? Does yours say that one?
It's near.
Near?
Yes.
Okay.
Hát azt mondja, hogy közel van.
In the English, nigh at hand is very close to the message that John the Baptist gave with respect to Jesus appearing.
Az angolban egy olyan kifejezést használ, ami szinte teljesen ugyanaz a megfogalmazás, mint amit keresztelő János használt, amikor Jézus királyságát hirdette.
Now this is very interesting because this is nearness to the second coming of Jesus.
Ez azért nagyon érdekes, mert itt Jézus második eljövetelének közelségéről van szó.
We know that the harvest has to occur before Jesus comes.
És tudjuk azt, hogy az aratásnak Jézus eljövetele előtt végbe kell mennie.
It says, blow a trumpet in Zion.
És azzal kezdi az igevers, hogy fújjátok a kürtöt a Sionon.
Now, could this be this trumpet?
Lehetséges, hogy erről a kürtzengésről van itt
In
szó,
the end of time, on the 7th month of the first day of the month,
ami a vég idején, a 7. hónap első napján történik.
what would this possibly signify, this blowing of the trumpet?
Mit jelképezhet ez a kürtzengés?
I said earlier that when a trumpet was sounded in ancient Bible times,
Előzőleg említettem, hogy amikor kürtöt fújtak az ősi Izraelben,
it was blown as a warning message.
ez egyrészt egy figyelmeztető üzenet volt,
It was blown to gather the people,
azért fújták meg, hogy összegyűjtsék az embereket,
and it was blown for preparation for war.
illetve azért, hogy háborúra vagy harcra hívják, gyűjtsék az embereket.
Keep your finger here and roll to Isaiah 58.
Tartsuk itt az ujjunkat, de lapozzuk fel közben Ézsaiás 58. fejezetét. Ézsaiás 58.
Very familiar verse.
Jól ismerjük ezt az igeverset.
It says, cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet.
Első versben.
Show my people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins.
Tehát az első versben ezt mondja, kiálts teljes torokkal, ne kíméld, mint trombita, emeld fel hangodat, és hirdesd népemnek bűneiket, és Jákob házának vétkeit.
This verse says, cry aloud.
Ez az igevers azt mondja, hogy kiálts teljes torokkal, hangosan.
In the end, we call it the loud cry.
A végidőben ismerjük ezt a kifejezést, hogy a hangos kiáltás.
It says to lift up your voice like a trumpet.
Azt mondja, hogy emeld fel hangodat, mint trombita.
Could this be the time of the loud cry?
Lehetséges, hogy ez a hangos kiáltás ideje?
A time for the last message to go to God's people?
Hogy ez a kürtzengés az Isten népéhez szóló utolsó üzenet?
Why would this message need to come with such an urgency?
Miért kell ennek az üzenetnek olyan sürgetően hangzania?
Because the Day of Atonement draws near.
Mert az engesztelési nap közel van.
Turn with me to Revelation 18.
Lapozzuk fel Jelenések 18-at.
Starting in verse 1 it says,
Első verstől kezdve olvassuk.
After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven having great power. And the earth was lighted with his glory.
És ezek után láttam más angyalt leszállani a mennyből, akinek nagy hatalma volt, és a föld fény lett annak dicsőségétől.
We have been told that this will be the greatest message that has ever been given to the world.
Erről azt olvassuk, hogy ez a földnek adatott leghatalmasabb, legnagyobb üzenet.
It is the time of the latter rain.
Ez a késő eső ideje.
This message is for the final harvest.
Ez az üzenet a végső aratáshoz kötődik.
This message will go forward with greater power than it did on the day of Pentecost.
Ez az üzenet még nagyobb hatalommal fog előre haladni, mint pünkösd napján.
I wonder why.
Vajon miért?
I think it would be pretty important to warn the world if you knew what day this was coming.
Azt gondolom, hogy rendkívül fontosnak éreznénk figyelmeztetni a világot, hogyha tudnánk, hogy mikor lesz a nagy engesztelési nap.
And here's the message.
És itt van az üzenet,
Verse 2.
második versben.
Cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies.
Harmadik versben ezt mondja. És kiáltott teljes erejéből nagy szóval mondván, leomlott a nagy Babilon, és lett ördögöknek lakhelyévé, minden tisztátalan léleknek tömlöcévé, és minden tisztátalan és gyűlölséges madárnak tömlöcévé. Mert az ő paráznasága haragjának borából ivott valamennyi nép, és a földnek királyai ővele paráználkodtak, és a földnek kalmárai az ő dobzódásának erejéből meggazdagodtak.
In verse 2 it says he cried mightily with a strong voice.
Második vers azt mondja, hogy kiáltott teljes erejéből, nagy szóval.
Cry aloud.
Kiálts teljes torokkal.
Lift up your voice like a trumpet.
Mint trombita emelt fel hangodat.
Interesting.
Érdekes.
And it says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues.
Negyedik versben folytatja, és hallék más szózatot a mennyből, amely ezt mondta. Fussatok ki belőle, én népem, hogy ne legyetek részesek az ő bűneiben, és ne kapjatok az ő csapásaiból.
When did the plagues begin to fall?
Mikor kezdtek hullani a csapások?
Sometime after the Day of Atonement.
Az nagy engesztelési nap után valamikor.
This message is to call all of God's people from the entire world out of Babylon.
Ennek az üzenetnek Isten népét mindenhol szerte a világon ki kell szólítani a Babilonból.
To prepare them for this.
Hogy felkészítse őket az engesztelés napjára.
So that they don't receive of the plagues.
Hogy ne kapjanak a csapásokból.
It's going to probably be the greatest message that has ever gone forward.
Valószínűleg ez lesz a valaha létezett leghatalmasabb üzenet.
And what a privilege this will be.
Micsoda kiváltság lesz ez.
This message says, come out of her, my people. Who's speaking?
Ez az üzenet azt mondja, jöjjetek ki belőle, én népem. Ki beszél itt? The Lord.
Christ.
Krisztus.
But this message is going to go forward by you and me.
De ez az üzenet rajtad és rajtam keresztül fog szólni.
So whose words are we going to be speaking?
Akkor kinek a szavait szóljuk majd?
We're going to be speaking Christ. Jesus said, the words that I speak, they're not my own.
Krisztus szavait, maga Krisztus azt mondta, hogy a beszédek, amiket én mondok, nem az enyém.
The things that I hear from my Father, those are the things that I say.
Amiket hallok az én atyámtól, azokat mondom.
What an exciting time that will be to have Christ speaking through us.
Milyen rendkívüli idő ez. Krisztus szól általunk.
Notice as it continues on in Joel chapter 2.
Visszatérve Jóel második fejezetéhez,
It talks about the people who give this message.
azokról az emberekről beszél, akik ezt az üzenetet hirdetik.
In verse 2 it says, a day of darkness and gloominess.
A második versben így folytatja.
A day of clouds and thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and strong. There hath not ever been the like, neither shall any more after it, even unto the years of many generations.
Sötétségnek és homálynak napja, felhőnek és borulatnak napja, mint a hegyekre ráterülő alkonyat. Nagy és hatalmas nép, amilyen nem volt öröktől fogva, és nem is lesz utána többé nemzetségről nemzetségre.
The earth has never seen anybody like the people that are going to give this message.
A világ még soha nem látott ilyen hadsereget, mint ezek az emberek, akik ezt az üzenetet hirdetik.
In verse 3 it says, a fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Yea, nothing shall escape. The appearance of them is as horses, and the appearance of horses, and as horsemen, so shall they run. Like the noise of chariots on the tops of mountains shall they leap, like the noise of a flame. Fire devoureth the stubble. As a strong people set in battle array, and emphasize that.
Így folytatja ennek a seregnek a leírását. Előtte tűz emészt, utána láng lobog. Előtte a föld olyan, mint az édenkertje, utána pedig kietlen pusztaság. Meg sem menekülhet tőle semmi. Amilyen a lovak alakja, olyan annak alakja. És száguldoznak, mint a lovasok. Rohannak a hegyek tetején, mint hadi szekerek robognának. Mintha tarlót emésztő láng ropogna, amilyen az ütközetre kész hatalmas nép.
These people are powerful.
Ezek az emberek hatalommal rendelkeznek.
It says they are set in battle array. This is an army.
Azt mondja, hogy ez egy ütközetre kész hatalmas sereg.
One of the things that the blowing of the trumpets was to do was to gather God's people, their army.
Az egyik dolog, amiről beszéltünk, hogy a kürtöt megfújták, az az volt, hogy összegyűjtse Isten népét a harcra.
As a result of what this army does, in verse 6, it says, "Before the faces, the people shall be much pained, and all faces gather blackness."
Az egyik eredménye ennek a seregnek, ennek a munkálkodásának, a 6. versben ezt mondja, elrémülnek tőle a népek, minden arc elsápad.
This great message, it disturbs the people of the earth who aren't willing to accept it.
Ez az üzenet, amit ezek az emberek hirdetnek, felkavarja mindazokat az embereket, akik nem akarják ezt befogadni.
There is a vision that Ellen White had called the shaking.
Ellen White-nak van egy látomása, ami a rostálás nevet viseli.
It's in the testimonies.
A bizonyságtételek kötetekben van.
Early writings.
Korai írások.
Numerous places.
Több helyen is megvan.
And she talks about this very experience of God's people in the end of time.
És pontosan erről a tapasztalatról beszél Isten népének a vég idején, erről a tapasztalatáról.
I would like you to read it. I'm going to read part of it.
Szeretném, hogyha ti is elolvasnátok magatoknak, most csak egy részt olvasok el belőle.
I'm going to summarize some of it because I have mercy on my brother here.
Most csak össze fogom foglalni, mert nem akarom kínozni a tolmácsot.
It starts out by saying, I saw some with strong faith and agonizing cries pleading with God.
Azt írja, láttam némelyeket, akik erős hittel és gyötrődő könyörgések között könyörögtek Istenhez.
It says large drops of perspiration fell from their foreheads.
Hatalmas izzadságcseppek hullottak alá homlokaikról.
They're going through a struggle.
Óriási küzdelemben voltak.
What does large drops of sweat from the forehead remind you of?
Mire emlékeztet benneteket a homlokról aláhulló nagy izzadságcseppek? Getsemani.
Exactly, the experience of Jesus.
Jézus tapasztalatára a Getsemánéban, így van.
It says, evil angels crowd around to press darkness upon them.
A gonosz angyalok körül fogják őket, hogy sötétségbe burkolják őket.
Notice what they're trying to do.
Figyeljétek meg jól, hogy mit próbálnak megtenni.
It says they're trying to shut Jesus from their view.
Hogy megpróbálják kizárni Jézust a látóterükből.
Do you see what the devil's trying to do?
Látjuk azt, hogy mire törekszik a sátán.
He knows that if Jesus is removed from our view, we are as weak as straw.
Ő pontosan tudja, hogy ha Jézust elveszítjük a tekintetünk elől, olyanok gyengék vagyunk, mint egy szalmaszál.
These people have strong faith.
De ezeknek az embereknek erős hitük van.
And it doesn't work.
És nem sikerül ez a csalás.
Many of them are resisting the darkness, which means they're keeping their eyes focused on Christ.
Sokan közülük ellenállnak a sötétség erőinek, ami azt jelenti, hogy Jézusra szegezik folyamatosan a tekintetüket.
But some will not keep their eyes focused on Christ.
Némelyek viszont nem tartják a tekintetüket Jézuson.
They will not bear the straight testimony, it says.
Azt írja róluk, hogy ők nem hajlandók elfogadni az egyenes bizonyságtételt.
But those that hold on to Christ, watch what happens to them.
De azok, akik ragaszkodnak Krisztushoz, nézzétek meg velük, mi történik.
They have been shaken.
Ők megrostáltatnak, megrázatnak.
But said the angel, look ye, my attention was turned to the company that I had seen, who were mightily shaken. I was shown those whom I had before seen weeping and praying in agony of spirit. The company of guardian angels around them had doubled, and they were clothed with armor from head to their feet. They moved in exact order, like a company of soldiers.
Ezt mondja, és ezt fel is olvasom. Ezt mondta az angyal, nézd csak, ekkora figyelmem arra a társaságra irányult, akiket láttam, hogy rendkívül meglettek rázva, vagy meglettek rostálva. Azokat láttam, akiket korábban sírni és imádkozni láttam nagy lelki gyötrődés közepette. Az őrző angyalok seregei megkétszereződtek körülöttük, és páncélzatba, tehát fegyverzetbe voltak öltözve, tetőtől talpig. Rendezett csapatként mozogtak, mint egy katonacsapat.
A company of soldiers.
Mint egy katonacsapat.
An army.
Egy hadsereg.
What are we reading about?
Miről olvasunk itt?
We're reading about this great army of God's.
Jóel 2-ben erről az isteni hadseregről beszélünk.
A people that the world has never seen before.
Egy olyan hadseregről, egy olyan népről, amit a világ még soha nem látott.
It says that there were some who were shaken out.
Írja, igen, hogy némelyek kirostáltattak.
But it says their places were immediately filled by others taking hold of the truth and coming into the ranks.
De azt írja, hogy ezeknek a helyei, akik kirostáltattak, azonnal fel lettek töltve mások által, akik megragadták az igazságot, és beálltak a csatarendbe.
What does ranks mean to you?
I translated it the war line. Or
War
the
line?
war
Okay.
order.
All right, that's fine. Yeah. Who are these people?
Kik ezek az emberek?
I heard those clothed with the armor speak forth great truth with great power. Go ahead and stop right there.
Hallottam, hogy azok, akik ebbe a fegyverzetbe fel voltak öltözve, igazságot szóltak nagy hatalommal.
They speak the
Az
truth
igazságot.
with great power.
Az igazságot szólják nagy hatalommal.
It had its effect.
Megvolt a hatása.
Many had been bound by families, but nothing was important to them but truth alone.
Nagyon sokakat, most csak összefoglalom, nagyon sokakat kötött eddig a családjuk, de ezután semmi mással nem törődtek már, csak az igazsággal.
The truth was more dear to them than life itself.
Az igazság fontosabbá vált számukra, mint az élet maga.
I had asked, what made this great change?
Feltettem a kérdést, mi okozta ezt a nagy változást?
And the angel answered,
És az angyal így felelt.
it is the latter rain, the refreshing
késői
from the presence
eső.
of the Lord, the loud cry of the third angel.
A késői eső, az Úr színétől jövő felüdülés, a hangos kiáltás, a harmadik angyal hangos kiáltása.
Brothers and sisters, I believe that what we're reading in Joel chapter 2 is the loud cry.
Kedves testvérek, meggyőződésem, hogy a Jóel könyve második fejezetében olvasott profécia a hangos kiáltásról szól.
If you read on, it talks about them marching in perfect order.
Hogyha tovább olvassuk, azt látjuk, hogy ez a hadsereg tökéletes rendben vonul.
Shoulder to shoulder, side by side, perfect unity.
Váll a vállhoz, teljes egységben.
It says if they fall on the sword, they shall not be wounded.
Azt írja róluk, which verse?
Verse 8.
A 8. versben azt mondja, hogy neki rohannak a fegyvernek, és egy sem, vagy nem esik rajtuk seb.
It talks about them climbing on the rooftops, going through the windows, everywhere they go.
Felmásznak a háztetőkre, bemásznak az ablakokon, mindenhova eljutnak.
It says in verse 10, the earth shall quake before them, and the heaven shall tremble. The sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withhold their shining.
10. versben ezt mondja, reszket előttük a föld, megrendülnek az egek, a nap és a hold elsötétednek, a csillagok is bevonják fényüket.
It says, and the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great, and he is strong that executeth his word. The day of the Lord is great and very terrible, who can abide it?
És megzendül az Úrnak szava az ő serege előtt, mert feletten nagy az ő tábora, mert hatalmas az ő rendeletének végrehajtója. Bizony nagy az Úrnak napja, és igen rettenetes. Ki állhatja ki azt?
It says, the Lord shall utter his voice before his army. Come out of her, my people.
Ezt mondja, hogy megzendül az Úrnak szava az ő serege előtt. Jöjjetek ki belőle, én népem.
Then it says, rend your heart and not your garments.
Ezután így folytatja, hogy szíveteket szaggassátok meg, ne ruháitokat.
It talks about the Lord in His mercy leaving a meat offering and a drink offering.
Azt mondja, hogy ki tudja, hát ha visszatér és megbánja és áldás hagy maga után étel és italáldozatot az Úrnak, a ti isteneteknek, 14. versben.
Now the scene takes a turn.
Most itt egy képváltást látunk.
In verse 15 it says, blow the trumpet in Zion, sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and those that suck breast. Let the bridegroom go forth from her chamber and the bride out of her closet. Let the priests and the ministers of the Lord weep between the porch and the altar. Let them say, spare thy people, O Lord. Please emphasize that strongly. And give not thine heritage to reproach, that the heathen should rule over them. Wherefore should they say among the people, where is their God?
Tehát 15. verstől, fújjatok kürtöt a Sionon, szenteljetek böjtöt, hirdessetek gyűlést, gyűjtsétek össze a népet, szenteljétek meg a gyülekezetet, hívjátok egybe a véneket, gyűjtsétek össze a kisdedeket és a csecsszopókat, menjen ki a vőlegény az ő ágyasházából, és a mennyasszony is az ő szobájából. A tornác és az oltár között sírjanak a papok, az Úr szolgái, és mondják, légy kegyelmes, ó Uram, a te népedhez, és ne bocsáss szidalomra a te örökségedet, hogy uralkodjanak rajtuk a pogányok. Miért mondanák a népek között, hol az ő Istenük?
Now this is very important.
Ez nagyon-nagyon fontos.
There's another blowing of the trumpet.
Van egy újabb kürtcengés.
Did they blow the trumpet on the Day of Atonement?
A nagy engesztelési napon is megfújják a kürtöt?
It stumped me for a while.
Itt egy pillanatra megálltam.
But I believe that these verses are talking about the Day of Atonement.
De hiszem, hogy ezek az igeversek a nagy engesztelési napról szólnak.
What was to be done on the Day of Atonement?
Mit kellett tenniük az embereknek a nagy engesztelési napon?
All of Israel was to be gathered.
Az egész Izraelt egybe kellett gyűjteni.
No one was to be left out.
Senkit nem szabad volt kihagyni.
These people are afflicting their souls.
Ezek az emberek megsanyargatják a lelküket.
They're crying unto the Lord.
Kiáltanak az Úrhoz.
No one is exempt, not the bridegroom.
Semmilyen kivétel nincs, még a vőlegény sem,
Who has gone on his honeymoon.
aki éppen a nászúton van.
Not the woman who has bore a child.
Még az az asszony sem, aki éppen most szült.
If anyone did not afflict their souls on the Day of Atonement, they were cut off from Israel.
Az az ember, aki nem sanyargatta meg az ő lelkét Izraelben a nagy engesztelés napján, kivágattatott Izraelből.
More than that, in Leviticus it says that God would destroy them.
Sőt, Isten azt is mondja nekik 3 Mózesben, hogy Isten elpusztítja azokat.
When I think of the time of the sealing,
hogyha az elpecsételésről gondolkodom,
when the third angel goes forward and says he has completed his work by writing, putting a mark on God's people, on their foreheads.
Repeat that.
When the third angel goes back to heaven and says his work is
Tehát
complete.
amikor a harmadik angyal visszatér a hírrel, hogy megtörtént az elpecsételés, és a homlokra felírták a jelet, a pecsétet.
The work is complete. And if you read Ezekiel 9, what happens to God's people?
Akkor teljes a munka, és hogyha elolvassuk Ezékiel 9-et, hogy mi történik ekkor Isten népével,
That have not sighed and cried for the abominations done in the church.
Hogy azok, akik nem sírtak, és nem kiáltottak az egyházon belüli utálatosságok miatt,
It says the men with slaughter weapons come through.
azok között elmennek közöttük az öldöklő angyalok.
And it says start at my house.
És ezt mondja nekik az utasítás, hogy az én házamon kezdjétek.
They're afflicting their souls. The close of
Tehát
probation.
megsanyargatják az ő lelküket.
They're in grave danger.
Mert a kegyelemidő végén rettenetes veszélyben forognak.
The people are angry. They've been stirred up as a result of the message.
Mert az emberek felbűszítette őket az üzenet.
And they're crying, make a way of escape for us, Lord.
És így kiáltanak, hogy adj nekünk kimenekedést, Uram.
In verse 17 it says, spare thy people, O Lord, and give not thine heritage to reproach, that the heathen should rule over them. Wherefore should they say among the people, where is thy God?
17. versben azt mondja, hogy légy kegyelmes, ó Uram, a te népedhez, és ne bocsáss szidalomra a te örökségedet, hogy uralkodjanak rajtuk a pogányok. Miért mondanák a népek között, hol az ő Istenük?
In the vision of the shaking, Ellen White almost uses some of these exact words.
A rostálásról szóló fejezetben Ellen White ugyanezeket a szavakat használja.
She says, great power was given to the chosen ones.
Azt írja róluk, hogy a választottaknak rendkívüli erő adatott.
The angel said, look ye.
Az angyal ezt mondta, figyelj csak.
My attention was turned to the wicked or unbelievers. They were all astir. The zeal and power of the people of God had aroused and enraged them.
A figyelmem ekkor a gonoszokra és hitetlenekre irányult. Mindnyájan fel voltak kavarva. Az Isten népének buzgalma és hatalma felkavarta őket, és felbűszítette őket.
And here's what they cry. Thy will, O God, be done, if it can glorify thy name. Make a way of escape for thy people. Deliver us from the heathen round about us. They have appointed us unto death, but thine arm can bring salvation.
A hívők pedig így kiáltanak, a te akaratod, ó Isten, az legyen meg, hogyha ez megdicsőíti a te nevedet, akkor adj kimenekedést a te népednek. Szabadíts meg bennünket a körülöttünk lévő pogányoktól. Ők halálra adtak bennünket, de a te karod ad nekünk szabadítást.
Almost the exact same wording.
Szinte ugyanezeket a kifejezéseket használja.
I know I'm taking long and you're tired.
Tudom, hogy kicsit hosszúra nyúlt, és már fáradunk.
The 7th month, the 10th day.
7. hónap, 10. nap.
5 days later was the Feast of Tabernacles.
5 nappal később van a sátoros ünnep.
You can read about it in the book of Zechariah.
Erről Zakariás könyvében olvasunk.
In Zechariah chapter 10, around verse 5, you can also see the armies of God and the latter rain.
Zakariás 10:5-ben olvashatunk ismét Istennek erről a hadseregéről és a késő esőről.
But this makes me think, probation closes.
De ez elgondolkodtatott engem, mert ha lezárul a kegyelemidő,
5 days later a significant event begins and lasts for 7 days.
5 nappal később, 5 nappal ezután egy újabb rendkívüli esemény veszi kezdetét, ami 7 napig tart.
When Noah entered the ark and God closed the door.
Amikor Noé belépett a bárkába, és Isten bezárta utána az ajtót,
probation closed.
Lezárult a kegyelemidő.
Did anything happen on the first day?
Történt valami az első nap?
Second day.
Második nap?
It's interesting that there's a pause after the Day of Atonement, about 5 days.
Érdekes, hogy a nagy engesztelési nap után van egy szünet. 5 napos szünet.
I don't know.
Nem tudom.
I wonder if this is the beginning of the outpouring of the plagues.
Nem tudom, hogy ez jelöli-e vajon a csapások kitöltetését.
We'll be called out of the cities.
Ki kell vonulni a városokból.
We'll be dwelling in solitary places like they did when they were in the wilderness.
Eldugott helyeken kell majd laknunk, mint a zsidóknak, amikor a pusztában voltak.
It says that they're going to be happy.
Azt mondja, hogy boldogok lesznek.
When the children of Israel were delivered from the Egyptians.
Amikor Izrael fiai megszabadultak az egyiptomberiektől,
they weren't going into the promised land yet, they were going into the desert.
Először nem az ígéret földjére mentek, hanem a sivatagba.
They were living in tents.
Sátrakban laktak.
Were they happy?
Boldogok voltak?
Boy, they were rejoicing because they had been delivered from the Egyptians as a result of the Red Sea.
Csodálatosan örvendeztek, mert megszabadultak az egyiptomiaktól a Vörös-tengeren keresztül.
And the Lord wanted to take them directly into the promised land, didn't he?
És az Úr közvetlenül az ígéret földjére akarta őket bevezetni, nem?
But it was as a result of their sins that they were stuck in the wilderness for 40 years.
De a bűneik miatt ragadtak ott 40 évig a pusztában.
There are some other interesting visions by Ellen White.
Van Ellen White-nak néhány más érdekes látomása is.
I don't know if you remember this morning I told you that the Jubilee began on the Feast of Tabernacles.
Nem tudom, említettem-e már délelőtt, hogy a Jubileum például a sátoros ünnepen kezdődött.
All of the captives are set free.
Illetve hát a sátoros ünnepen lépett érvénybe a Jubileum, amikor elengedték a foglyokat, a szolgákat.
These things make me think all the time.
Ezek a dolgok mindig elgondolkodtatnak.
When Christ is done,
amikor Krisztus elvégzi az ő munkáját,
he deals with Lucifer.
Akkor Luciferrel is elintézi, amit kell.
All of heaven is gathered.
Az egész menny egybegyűl.
When we go back to heaven, how many days are we going to be traveling on our way there?
Amikor a mennybe megyünk, hány napig fogunk utazni oda?
This feast lasts 7 days.
Ez az ünnep 7 napig tart.
I'd like to read you a little bit of this vision from Ellen White.
Szeretnék egy látomást szintén Ellen White-tól felolvasni.
It says, in the time of trouble we fled the cities and villages and were pursued by the wicked.
A nyomorúság idején elmenekültünk a városokból és a falvakból, de a gonoszok tovább üldöztek bennünket.
Then it talks about the sun coming, great things happening in nature.
És utána a természetben beálló nagy dolgokról beszél, amik történnek.
And then it says, and as God spoke the day and the hour of Jesus' coming.
És amikor Isten kijelentette Jézus eljövetelének napját és óráját,
he speaks a sentence and it rolls through the earth like thunder.
Azt tudja, hogy akkor szólt egy mondatot, amely végig gördült az egész földön, mint valami mennydörgés.
After each sentence, the saints cried, glory, hallelujah.
És minden egyes mondat után a szentek diadal kiáltásban törtek ki, hogy dicsőség, halleluja.
It says their faces are lighted up like the face of Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai.
Az arcuk pedig világított, mint Mózes arca, amikor lejött a Sinai hegyről.
It says the wicked cannot look upon our faces for the glory.
Azt írja, hogy a gonoszok nem tekinthettek az arcunkra a dicsőség miatt.
Then it says, then commenced the Jubilee, when the land should rest, and I saw the pious slave in triumph and victory, and shake off the chains that bound him, while his wicked master was in confusion, and knew not what to do, for the wicked could not understand the words of the voice of God.
Ezt írja utána, hogy ekkor kezdetét vette a jubileum, amikor a föld megpihen. Láttam, hogy a kegyes rabszolga győzelmesen kel fel sírjából, lerázza a láncokat, amelyek megkötötték. Bocsánat, azt nem írja, hogy sír. A kegyes szolga győzelmesen kel fel, lerázza a láncokat, amelyek megkötötték, míg gonosz mestere zavarban van, és nem tudja, mit évő legyen, mert a gonoszok nem értették az Isten szavát, az Isten hangjának szavait.
So here's what has to happen after the Day of Atonement.
Tehát ennek kell megtörténni a nagy engesztelési nap után.
The plagues have to fall.
Kitöltetnek a csapások.
I don't know how long that is.
Nem tudom, ez meddig fog tartani.
But without water,
de víz nélkül,
the sun scorching the earth,
kegyetlenül tűző nap mellett,
there wouldn't be anyone left if it went on for very long.
Nem tarthat ez olyan sokáig, mert különben senki nem maradna meg.
It says here that they're going to try to kill us.
Azt mondja ezután, hogy ezután megpróbáltak megölni bennünket.
It says God is going to announce the day and the hour of Christ's coming.
És Isten kinyilatkoztatja, bejelenti Jézus eljövetelének napját és óráját.
Now I've thought about this one for a while.
Hát ezen egy ideig elgondolkodtam.
It doesn't make any sense to say, I'm coming today.
Nincs értelme azt mondani valakinek, hogy ma jövök.
You understand what I mean?
Értitek, hogy mit mondok?
It just doesn't make any sense. So
Ennek nincs értelme.
for God to announce the day and the hour of Christ's coming.
Hogyha Isten ő kijelenti, vagy bejelenti Jézus eljövetelének napját és óráját,
Seems to be as though there's a short time before Christ comes after that announcement.
a számomra azt sugallja, hogy van még egy rövid idő a bejelentés és a tényleges eljövetel között.
Maybe 7 days?
Lehet, hogy 7 nap?
I don't know.
Nem tudom.
All I know is when I look into these things, I get excited.
Csak azt tudom, hogy amikor ezeket tanulmányozom, ez nagyon fellelkesít.
The corn and the wine is restored.
A gabona és a bor helyreállítatik.
Your young men and your old men shall dream dreams.
Joelben folytatva azt írja, hogy véneitek és ifjaitok álmokat látnak, látomásokat látnak.
It's verse 28. And it shall come to pass.
Hát a 28. versben van erről szó.
There is no reason anymore for God to withhold the great outpouring of His Spirit to us.
Tehát nincsen már oka annak, hogy Isten visszatartaná tőlünk az ő lelkének hatalmas áradását.
Even though we don't see Jesus in the clouds, we have reached the fullness of the stature of the measure of Jesus Christ.
Bár még nem látjuk Krisztust felhőkön visszajönni, de már elértük a Krisztus teljességével ékeskedő kornak mértékét.
Ellen White says the final events will be rapid ones.
Ellen White azt írja, hogy a végső események nagyon gyorsan fognak egymás után következni.
I wish I knew what year this was going to be.
Bár csak tudnám, hogy mely évben lesznek meg ezek.
But who knows why God is agitating the mind?
De ki tudja, miért indít Isten arra, hogy ezeken gondolkodjunk?
Brother David a number of years ago did a study on how old the earth is.
Néhány évvel ezelőtt David tanulmányozta ezt a kérdést, hogy mennyi idős a Föld.
The earth is almost 6,000 years old.
Földünk már csak nem 6000 éves.
Does God do things in order?
Isten rendben teszi a dolgokat?
Is there a certain amount of time allotted to the devil?
Van egy meghatározott idő, ami az ördögnek adatott?
6,000 years here and 1,000 years in heaven is 7,000 years. 7 is a perfect number.
6000 év itt a Földön, 1000 év a mennyben. A 7000 év a 7 az egy tökéletes szám.
At the end of the 1,000 years we come back here and the wicked are destroyed.
És az 1000 év végén visszatérünk ide, a gonoszok megsemmisülnek.
Maybe if we knew when that 6,000th year was, I don't know.
Ha esetleg tudnánk, hogy áll össze ez a 6000 év, akkor talán tudhatnánk a végét.
I don't think Brother David knows exactly when it is.
Azt gondolom, hogy David testvér sem tudja, hogy mikor van a vége.
Some people have said 2016.
Egyesek azt mondják 2016-ban.
Some people have 2011 or 2019.
Mások 2019-et mondanak.
All I know is that it's close.
Az egyetlen, amit viszont biztosan tudok, hogy közel van.
Even at the doors.
Már az ajtóban.
So let us watch and be ready.
Úgyhogy vigyázzunk és legyünk készen.
Let's pray.
Imádkozzunk. Drága mennyi atyánk, köszönjük neked, hogy te feltárod előttünk a te titkaidat. Köszönjük neked azt, hogy te azért mutattad meg nekünk ezeket a dolgokat, hogy bátorságot és erőt merítsünk belőle. Atyánk, szeretnénk ott lenni mi is, ezek között, az emberek között, akiket Te fel tudsz használni ennek a világnak a figyelmeztetésére. Az utolsó munkában, Atyánk, Te tudod azt, hogy mi az, amire még szükségünk van, hogy elkészüljünk teljességgel. Látod azt, hogy mik azok, amik még kötnek bennünket ebben a világban, ami miatt nem tudjuk teljesen kiszolgáltatni magunkat neked. Kérünk Téged, hogy Te légy nekünk segítségül, hogy el tudjuk vágni ezeket a kötelékeket, hogy teljesen rád merjük bízni magunkat, hogy Te hatalmas munkát tudjál végezni, rajtunk keresztül is, másokért. Mennyi Atyánk, kérünk, hogy őrizd meg bennünket a közönytől, és Te add a mi szívünkbe azt a törekvést, hogy minden áron Krisztushoz ragaszkodjunk, és ne engedjük bármi által is elveszíteni őt, a mi tekintetünk elől. Ó, Atyánk, köszönjük neked, hogy Te megsegítesz bennünket, mert szeretsz. A Te fiad Jézus Krisztus által. Amen.